Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is a story about what if Deku was never saved. A twist in the hero world part 1. If you guys enjoy this what if and want to see part 2, comment down below and let me know before I start. Please do support for more awesome content. And leave a like and don't forget to subscribe to my channel and also share this video with your friends and check out the description in my playlist. So let's start the video. Some people are born lucky. This was something that 𝗧𝗵𝗲 had heard plenty of times in his life, especially in relation to quirks. He would hear them muttering to themselves or whispering in groups, glaring in secret as they looked at another. How lucky that person was to have such a flashy, useful quirk, that they had scored big time in the genetic lottery of life with their lives set on cruise control. It was no different than being born into a wealthy or influential family. Some people just had it made before they even opened their eyes for the first time. But for 𝗵𝗲, the truth was that some people were just born unlucky. It was a subtle but important difference. Nearly everyone was born with a quirk, and those without were growing more and more in the minority, to the point where it was almost extremely rare to find someone without something, anything, unique or fantastical about them. And it was that minority that 𝗵𝗲 belonged to. He had not been lucky to be born with the power to levitate objects like his mother or breathe fire like his father. He could not become a giant or manipulate his body like wood like some of the newest heroes on the block. No explosions came from his body or wings sprouting from his back. He didn't even have strength beyond imagination like his favorite hero 𝐼𝐺𝐸. Those people were all lucky to have been given the gift of quirks, while he was simply unlucky. That streak of unluckiness seemed to have escalated to a new high or low, depending how you looked at it, as he was suddenly thrown to the ground, falling onto his hands and knees as he gasped for air. With each intake of breath, 𝗵𝗲 slowly lifted his head. The events of the last few hours slowly coming back to him. How he was trying to lighten his spirits from a particularly bad day of school, laughing in an impersonation of his idol, 𝗬𝗏, as he walked under a bridge. The next thing he knew, he was being surrounded by sludge. He struggled as it quickly covered his body and entered his mouth. Slowly darkness began to overtake the green-haired teen, and the last thing he could clearly remember was a large, toothy mouth covering his own, thanking him for the body and calling him a hero. How he survived, 𝗵𝗲 had no idea as his vision blacked. Now that he was free, 𝗵𝗲 looked around to see that he was no longer in the city. Silence filled the air, save the wind blowing through the massive trees that surrounded them. Stars dotted the darkened sky, making 𝗵𝗲 wonder just how long he had been held captive. Hours, days, weeks, all of that seemed possible, especially in this era of quirks. His body trembled as the weight of this information fell upon him, bringing with it a new horrible implication. Just where was he? Without the knowledge of just how much time had passed. There was no way of knowing if he was in the woods near the city that he called home or if he had traveled across the ocean. Worst of all, he wasn't alone. "There you go, kid," laughed the sludge villain, its towering body looming just behind the freckled teen. Slowly, 𝗵𝗲 turned around to look at the gelatinous, sickly dark green form of the one who held his life in the palms of his slimy hands. His toothy grin hadn't changed since the first time 𝗵𝗲 had seen it, and his red eyes almost seemed to glow in the darkness. "Go on and catch your breath for a bit. Can't have you keeling over before I'm sure we've gotten away from the pros." As 𝗵𝗲's heart raced in utter panic, a circle of tears forming around his eyes, the grinning sludge man bent down on one of its disgusting knees. From there, the upper part of its body reformed in order to push itself out so that its grinning face was right in 𝗵𝗲's face. "Don't worry, I'll only need your body until we clear the forest. Then we can go our separate ways." The sludge villain's smile curled upwards even more, slightly parting open as it did so. Fear nearly made 𝗵𝗲's mind shut down, wanting nothing more than to escape this horrible sight. Yet, his brain was still functional enough to point out that the villain was most likely lying to him. Yes, there was a chance that this villain would let him go, but that chance was extremely small given that he had kidnapped a minor using his quirk. If he did and 𝗵𝗲 went to the police, they would have a great idea where he was, as well as officially knowing his crime. He was probably only saying this so that 𝗵𝗲 wouldn't fight him as much, not that it would do him any good anyways. The more realistic options were that he would either use 𝗵𝗲 as a hostage in case the pros showed up or just kill him to leave no witness. Heart pounding in his chest, 𝗵𝗲 balled his hands into fists, collecting dirt and grass as he did so. He was scared beyond belief. He knew he was powerless, as people had been telling him that since he was 4 years old. But if he was going to die anyway, shouldn't he do something? Even if it was just a token effort, wouldn't it be better to at least try and defy this living piling of sludge? To stand up, despite his fears, and tell the villain he was going to fight him. Just telling him off, even if it was a little, the equivalent of a tiny puppy barking at a hurricane, it would still be something. And, if this was going to be the end for him, it was better than doing a swan dive off the school roof, as 𝗵𝗃𝗲 had said. Before 𝗵𝗲 could even open his mouth, however, a noise similar to him now echoed unusually loud through the night sky. Both quirkless teen and villain blinked in utter confusion. their expressions asking if the other had heard that as well. Together they looked around with Midoriya wondering if they had stumbled upon a cat that had somehow developed a quirk that made its cry louder. Something like that would have been an amazing find, and maybe, if he was lucky, he could take some notes one last time. But if there was such a creature out there, neither of them voiced that they had found it. When their gazes returned to each other, a hint of red could be seen out of the corner of their eyes from above. The two moved their heads upwards in unison, seeing a sight that left them both screaming. For, crashing through the clouds above their heads, was an object unlike anything either of them had seen before. A cone of red, probably created due to friction in the atmosphere, surrounded the tip of the object that reminded Midoriya of a massive black crystal. The cone went all the way up to a large mass of grayish-white, which also had 4 more crystals pointing upwards in a claw-like manner. It took a second or two for the duo to process what was happening. Something was crashing down from the heavens and, by the looks of it, was going to either crash on them or near them. Once they realized this, the pair got to their feet to try and run away. But it was too late. The object, whatever it was, hit the ground with enough force that Midoriya was sent flying through the air as fire and dirt pelted his back. The world spun around with the boy screaming his lungs out, refusing to close his eyes and creep back into the darkness it would provide, fearing he would never escape it. Once or twice he thought he felt a part of his shoe or a finger graze a tree while flying through the air. Thankfully he had not made a full-on impact. Then, finally, Midoriya collided hard with the ground. A groan escaped the young teen as he pushed himself off the ground and looked back. What he saw brought forth another scream as he twisted his body so his back was lifted off the ground, staring wide-eyed at the forest behind him. Or, rather, the large gaping hole that had been a part of the forest whose edge he was dangerously close to. Dust flung from the impact still hung around the crater, filling it like mist and making it difficult to see inside. Despite that, the hole was massive, and Midoriya judged that it might be deep enough so that half of the apartment complex that he lived in with his mother could easily fit in. As the green-haired teen continued to stare at it, his mouth twisted into a happy grin despite how sore his body felt. He had survived. He had no idea how it had happened, be it simply being flung away from the impact due to the force, a hidden quirk he never knew he had, or he had rolled a natural 20 for his luck. But regardless of how it happened, he was alive and the villain was nowhere to be seen. Now he could make a break for it and find a way home. He could see his mother again, hugging her tightly as he explained why he was so late coming home. The teen's thoughts were suddenly interrupted by the quickly settling dust, revealing a sight that left Midoriya in a state of awe. Slowly getting to his feet, the tips of his shoes at the very edge of the crater, Midoriya could now clearly see that whatever had crashed was still perfectly intact. It laid on its side in the middle of the crater, a large red dome at the top of the grayish-white mass with those 4 crystals surrounding it. It was imposing, yet something about it drew Midoriya's attention all the more in sheer wonder. "Is this because of someone's quirk?" mumbled Izuku to himself as he began examining this thing from a safe distance. It is possible that this could be a transformation quirk of some kind, or their quirk allowed them to produce this. Why haven't I heard about this before? If there was a hero in Japan that could make something like this, the news feeds would have gone crazy. It could be from a hero overseas or someone whose quirk just manifested. But Midoriya paused to gulp as he looked upwards towards the now non-existent clouds. From what I could tell, that thing must have started falling from above the stratosphere, and it looks like it weighs a ton. How could someone create something like that and then launch it so high up? Was that a support item like a rocket ship? No, the government wouldn't allow it. For some reason, a shiver ran through the teen's body before he looked back down at the object. Slowly he began to examine it, starting with the 4 crystal-like spikes, wondering what they were made of. His eyes then roamed down to that grayish-white mass, wondering if it was made of metal or some other crystal. For a moment, he even entertained the idea that it might even be organic. Yet that didn't make any sense to him. Before Midoriya could look to the side to examine the last of the black crystals, he spotted something that caused his body to begin running down into the crater before his mind realized what was happening. Laying next to the main body of the object was the outline of a person, while nothing more than a speck to the teen from this distance. He could make out the red and black attire this person wore against the dirt and other rubble. Or, at least, he hoped that it was part of their costume and not blood. Just thinking about that caused Midoriya to run even faster, nearly tripping several times on the way down. His legs began to ache, but he ignored it while his eyes never left the unmoving figure. When he reached the bottom, the teen nearly fell forward into the ground but somehow managed to use the momentum to keep moving forward faster. When he finally got close enough, Midoriya saw that this person was a woman who looked to be in her late teens to early 20s. He sighed in relief when he saw that the red he had seen was not blood, but rather part of her half-red and half-black costume that clung to her slender form. Looking up, Midoriya took note of her long, spiky cyan hair. Happy to see that she didn't appear to be bleeding, Midoriya knelt down to check and see if she was breathing, only to reel back quickly while holding his nose. "SS sake," moaned the teen, identifying the scent that reeked off the woman. After taking a moment, Midoriya steeled himself as he went closer to her, placing his hand close to her mouth and nose. He smiled as he felt her breath on his hand. That was a good sign. But what should I do now? Mumbled Izuku as he pulled his hand away, bringing it to his chin as he began to go over his options. I really don't have any first aid skills beyond the basics. If I tried examining her myself any further, I might end up hurting her. Maybe I could try and take her to a hospital. But picking her up without knowing the full extent of her injuries might cause her more harm. There could be internal injuries that would be worsened if not handled properly. Not to mention the fact that I don't even know where I am right now. If I went the wrong way, then we might be traveling for days with her condition growing worse. Even if I did know the right way, the extra weight will slow me down. Leaving her here while I go by myself to find help is an option as well. I could potentially cover more ground that way. No, she'll be helpless if anything finds her. Maybe I could call someone and they could track my GPS. Quickly, Midoriya reached for his phone and turned it on ... only to frown. Of course, no bars. Would you keep it down a little? Came a muffled voice that nearly made Midoriya jump back in shock. Looking down, he saw that the woman was slightly biting her lower lip as her shoulder began to lift. Her eyes opened. Yellow orbs with black slits that reminded him of a cat or snake gazed at him. Be careful, began Midoriya, raising his hands slightly as the woman began to sit up. Careful, began the woman, only to stop with a sudden groan, her hands racing towards her head, clutching it tight. Oh my God, cried Midoriya, waving his hands in pure panic. You should lie back down. You were in a crash. And the woman stopped her groaning, opening a single eye to look at the green-haired teen. A crash? She asked before looking around her to take in the scenery around her for the first time. Midoriya sat there, expecting her to freak out, wondering what the hell happened to her. That or faint as the sheer weight of the situation fell upon her. What he was not expecting, however, was for her to simply shrug. I guess I was. Well, I've been in worse situations. What? Asked Midoriya, waving his hands around as the woman stood up, still holding her head. But her head injury. Chill out, it's just a hangover, she admitted with a wince. Not one of my finest moments. She paused to give Midoriya a small smile. Yet as she stood there, her legs began wobbling slightly. Fearing that she might fall down, the green-haired teen jumped up and, before he realized what he was doing, wrapped an arm around her waist. A moment passed as he helped keep the woman steady. His body pressed close to her own with his head meeting at her shoulder before she turned to look at him once more. Well, aren't we forward? Midoriya's face instantly turned scarlet. Small wisps of steam rising from the top of his forehead as both her words and the realization of what he was doing finally sank in. He was touching a woman that wasn't his mother, someone close to his own age. He was talking to her, and she was talking back to him. Well, he stammered. The apology he wanted to spit out becoming stuck in his throat while his body trembled. Thankfully, he did not let go of her to start waving his hands in protest. The woman threw her head back and laughed. Oh, relax, I'm only teasing, she said with a cute wink, causing the still red-faced teen to become silent as he looked away. But, really, thank you. The name's Ryoko, by the way. And what shall I call my knight in shining armor? Izuku Midoriya, the teen managed to say. And I'm not much of a... As his words trailed off, Ryoko gently placed her hands on the arm around her waist to push it off. Once free of his hold, the woman took a few steps forward before turning around to look at him with only the smallest of pained look. Anyways, we should be getting out of here. There's a villain nearby. Villain? Repeated Ryoko, looking a little nervous as she began scratching the back of her head rapidly while looking away. Well, that sounds ... bad. Do you know who this villain might be? Yeah, I've seen him myself, said Midoriya with a nod. Not noticing the sigh Ryoko let out. I don't know his real name, so I've just been referring to him as the sludge villain. From what I have seen firsthand, his quirk makes it so that his body is like slime or, sludge. He, sort of used it to take control of my body for a while. A thoughtful look then crossed Midoriya's face, a hand coming up to his chin as his thoughts began to spiral. But I'm sure that's not all he can do. With a body that is malleable, he can probably manipulate it to slide through cracks or holes, maybe even pipes, allowing him to go anywhere. He also seems to be able to manipulate his appearance, moving his mass around to alter the size and location of his features. Perhaps he could stretch himself to become larger. Possibly, but I don't think that would make him stronger. More likely, he could put as much mass as he could into a single limb, increasing the power of his blows. I wonder if... Midoriya managed to stop himself, realizing that he was mumbling again as his face went red once more. I'm sorry. I know this isn't the time for this. It's just a bad habit of mine. Hey, don't worry about it, said Ryoko, her hands going to her sides as she spoke. But Midoriya only noticed that briefly as something else caught his attention. It was the look she had in her eyes. She really didn't seem annoyed or angry like so many others when he began his muttering marathons. Instead, she looked impressed. In all honesty, it wasn't something he was used to seeing. Well, we'd better get going, stammered Midoriya, his eyes downcast as he spoke to hide his blush. While this blush hadn't turned his face beet red like prior blushes tonight, only warming up his cheeks, somehow it felt all the more embarrassing. Yet, oddly enough, it also felt kind of good. Turning away from her, Midoriya made his way to the incline that would lead them out. Upon closer examination, he saw that the dirt and rock looked fairly smooth with enough of an incline that they could walk up with only some difficulty. That said, fairly smooth and completely smooth were two different things. Just by looking around, Midoriya could see spots that appeared to be slightly more rigid or had bits of earth jutting out. However, there were areas that looked like a collection of stones that might give way if too much weight were put upon them. Biting his lower lip, Midoriya recalled his not so long ago sprint downward and how he himself had nearly tripped on the way. Whether that had been due to gravity combined with his own rapid momentum or the rocky terrain, he honestly couldn't remember. Overall, it seemed more than likely that they could just walk up and out of the crater, but it would be best if they played it safe and moved slowly. Midoriya's thoughts then shifted back to Ryoko. She seemed to be recovering from her hangover pretty quickly, but her head could still be hurting. That, along with how she wobbled when she first stood up, gave Midoriya some pause. Like that, she might not watch where she was going and if she made the wrong step. Gulping, Midoriya turned back to Ryoko and offered the woman his hand. "I can lead the way if you want," he said in a trembling voice, only briefly noticing the woman's shocked expression. For a few seconds, Midoriya just stood there as he mentally kicked himself for his stupidity. This was the longest conversation he had ever really had with a girl close to his own age, and now he was suggesting this. Ryoko probably thought he was just trying to act cool or something and was going to tell him that she didn't need some quirkless kid to hold her. Okay, sure, she didn't know he was quirkless, but oh, my hero. She giggled in a playful and not at all cruel manner as she took hold of his hand. Now Midoriya felt like his heart was going to explode out of his chest as he felt her bare skin against his own. He could feel how warm it was and, despite appearing dainty, it felt tough, like she had seen and been a part of plenty of fights before. Slowly he looked up and saw that Ryoko was smiling brightly at him with her eyes closed. "Right," Midoriya exclaimed with a nod, turning to lead them up and out of the crater. Midoriya's first step was almost robotic, lifting it up high and positioning it at a 90-degree angle before pressing down, the force which nearly caused the ground to give way. Thankfully, Midoriya didn't make an utter fool of himself, realizing he had to keep his wits focused on the path ahead. So with the slow and precious placement of his feet, the green-haired teen helped lead them both upwards. "So," said Ryoko after a minute or two had passed, "how did you meet this sludge villain? You live around here and ran into him? Or are you aiming to be a bounty hunter and you went after your first big payday?" Began Midoriya, his heart slowing down as he lowered his head in shame. "No, I'm just the unlucky guy he happened to kidnap. I'm not even sure where I am right now or how far away my home is. I couldn't even run away properly. I'm nothing special." As he said this last part, Midoriya thought he felt Ryoko's hand squeeze his own, but it was so brief that he probably just imagined it. So the teen just kept moving forward without bothering to look back. "Hey, it can only get better," said Ryoko. Her voice was lighter now, making it sound like she was trying to cheer him up. "I mean, sure, you got kidnapped and dragged all the way out into the middle of nowhere with no way of getting home." Midoriya felt his shoulders slump at that. The gravity of the situation he was in, something that had been on the back burner of his mind, had returned with force. "And look at you now. You managed to get away from this guy. Plus, now you get to have a midnight stroll through the forest with a pretty girl. So things are already looking up." Tears began to form in Midoriya's eyes, brimming with happiness by what she said. She was right. Things were looking up. He had gotten a chance to save. No, he had helped someone. Not save them. But he was still doing that. Helping someone in trouble without being asked is just like what a real hero would do. Just like what All Might would have done. What's more, he was doing it without a quirk. Maybe this was what he needed. Maybe he could hold on to this feeling whenever people told him he couldn't be a hero without a quirk and tell people like Kaken that they were wrong. He could do it. And with the sludge villain gone, it should be smooth sailing from here on. As Midoriya's foot stepped out onto the forest floor, the universe decided to punish the green-haired teen for his hopefulness, as a large mass of sludge began to form right in front of the pair. Sweat began to dampen Midoriya's fear-filled face as the sludge began to take shape, soon becoming the very being that he had thought wouldn't show up. "Haha," laughed the sludge villain as he looked down at Midoriya. "Not very bright, are you, kid? Just wasted your one chance to make a break for it. Should have run off while you could. Oh, and what do we have here?" The sludge villain's eye turned to look past Midoriya while a lecherous grin grew. "It seems like my day just keeps getting better and better. First I managed to shake him off my tail and now I get to have some fun." "Shut up," yelled Midoriya as he took a step forward. "Ryoko, run." I'll hold him off for Midoriya's words were cut off as sludge descended upon him, quickly filling his mouth and lungs. The boy struggled, clawing at the stench-covered substance that began to consume him. Somehow, either by his own will or that of the villain, he was turned to face Ryoko. She was just standing there, eyes wide and head tilted to the side like she was trying to comprehend what she was seeing. Ha ha ha, came the villain's laughter right in Midoriya's ear. You really must be stupid, kid. Face it, you're powerless against me. If you had any quirk that could have even slowed me down, you would have used it the first time I did this to you. Now be a good little body for me and just surrender so I can have some fun with that girl. Oh, really? Came Ryoko's voice, sounding both sweet and dangerous at the same time, giving the teenage boy shivers. As Midoriya's vision began to grow dark once more, he saw that Ryoko's eyes had narrowed and a smile played on her lips that didn't look like the ones he had seen before. It sort of reminded him of the smile a predator would have when spotting its prey, but maybe he was just seeing things. After all, his brain was shutting down due to a lack of air, while his vision began to swirl in darkness. Then, suddenly, air filled his lungs once more as he was pulled out of the sludge villain and tossed to the ground. But the weird thing was that it didn't feel like he had been pulled out in the normal sense. No, it was more like the sludge around him no longer existed, the area surrounding him feeling like a heavy mist while he was being pulled out by Ryoko's hand. The boy then looked up and saw Ryoko standing in front of the sludge villain, an orb of bright red light in her hand that seemed to crackle as if electricity was dancing around it. The red light shined in the sludge villain's eyes, reflecting his fear. Then, in the span of a breath, the orb was fired out into the sludge villain's chest, causing him to explode. Midoriya could only watch with wide eyes as pieces of the criminal flew in every direction, splashing onto trees and plants before rolling down towards the earth. That was amazing, exclaimed Midoriya as an excited smile appeared on his face. You have to be an amazing up-and-coming hero with a quirk that powerful. Why haven't I heard of you before? Is it because you're so new? I bet you just graduated from UA. Midoriya's mind was going into overdrive, trying to figure out what her quirk was. A dispersal quirk. That was a possibility. If she could disperse anything, then she could disperse the damage she took from an attack or a fall or a crash. It would also explain how she had been able to save him and defeat the villain. No doubt he was just split in pieces and she had the means to bring the villain back together. Heroes didn't kill after all. Sorry, Izuku, but I'm no hero, said Ryoko as she turned around while placing a hand on her hip, causing the boy's blood to run cold. He now looked up at the woman before him, her eyes still narrowed as they seemed to glow yellow in the pale moonlight. What was all the teen could say, a new layer of sweat appearing on his forehead while his tear ducts began to prepare for another use. Never said I was a hero. Allow me to properly introduce myself. I am Ryoko, the most wanted and dangerous space pirate in the known universe. As if to punctuate this, the woman before him created a blade of red energy in one hand that reminded Izuku of the weapons in the ancient Star Wars movies. The lightsabers, only she didn't need a device to make it. And she was pointing it right at his chest. That's, began Izuku as he wanted to deny this, to say there were no such things as aliens or that there couldn't be one in front of him. Yet his mind was letting the pieces fall into place. It made too much sense. The object that fell from the sky was a spaceship. That's why she was in the crater with it. And her weapon, crab. And today is your lucky day, Izuku, said Ryoko as she began to float in the air a bit, her blade still pointed at the teen. Because I've taken a liking to you. You are joining my crew. For a moment, Izuku could only stare at her in wide-eyed silence. Is this optional? He asked, his gaze shifting from the woman to the blade she held and then back to Ryoko. What do you think? A cry escaped Midoriya's throat as he spun around. His survival instincts finally kicking, he ran with all his might through the woods. One of his red sneakers stepped in the sludge, nearly causing him to slip and fall, but he managed to right himself. Teeth clenched, tears began running down his face. He didn't want to go into space. He didn't want to be a villain. He didn't want to be a space villain. No, appearing in front of Midoriya was Ryoko. His brain paused for a moment, processing what had happened. He didn't see her super speed in front of him or fly. Had she teleported? Could she teleport? A question for later for, as Ryoko swung her blade, Midoriya managed to duck under it. Thanks to the many times he had to escape from bullies in school, Midoriya knew how to quickly turn on his heels without losing his speed and zip past Ryoko. Laughter erupted behind him, followed by one of those red orbs zooming past his sides. It landed several feet in front of him, causing the earth to explode and trees to singe. But the boy didn't slow down, waving his arms around as if he were trying to claw through the air itself, as if hoping that would increase his speed just a little. Random noises escaped his mouth as he ran with all the strength he could muster as another orb was launched from behind, missing him again only to explode in the area in front of him. As more dirt and splinters of wood rained down on him, Midoriya heard more laughter behind him. He looked behind him, eyes widening in fear beyond measure as he saw Ryoko passing through the trees as if she were a ghost. There was no doubt in his mind now that she was an alien of some kind to do all this. Before Midoriya could look away, Ryoko vanished from his sight. For a brief moment, the teen wondered if she had just given up. Foolish, he realized, for when he turned to look in front of him again he found her floating there. With her free hand, Ryoko pointed at the ground before him and shot a smaller red beam from her finger which scorched the ground in front of Midoriya and caused him to fall on his ass. As she slowly floated towards him, Izuku Midoriya despaired as he finally realized something. She was playing with him. With all those abilities, she could have taken him whenever she wanted. So you finally figured it out, said Ryoko as she teleported in front of him, blade mere centimeters from Midoriya's chest. It's hopeless. No, screamed Midoriya, body shaking as he stared up at Ryoko, who looked shocked for a moment. He wasn't going to let it end here. He wasn't going to just give up. With eyes full of determination, he stared right up at Ryoko, ready to defy her to the end. I'm not going with you into space. I'm staying here so I can fulfill my dream of becoming a great hero. Someone who saves everyone he can with a smile on his face. Even if you take me away into space, I'll try every day to escape and come back. Tears were now streaming down his eyes. But despite that, he gave Ryoko the most determined look he could. His teeth then clenched as he prepared himself for whatever resistance of futile speech she would give him. Something that he would deny for. Okay, said Ryoko as her sword vanished and the playful, friendly smile returned to her face. Let's do that then. What? Midoriya felt both his brain and his tear ducts shutting down as he tried to make sense of what she just said, at just how random she seemed to be. Was she insane? Seeing this, Ryoko just laughed as her hands moved behind her head and her legs crossed as she continued to float in the air. Come on, it sounds like a fun way to pass the time, she explained, a mischievous smile playing on her lips as she looked down at Izuku. So what do we need to do to make you a hero on this planet? Well, it's a little complicated, began Izuku. There's a lot of steps to becoming a professional hero. Like, getting a license and going to school, and Izuku then lowered his head slightly, a frown appearing on his face as he stared at the dirt. But everyone around me says that it's impossible to get into a good school like you without a quirk. Sure, the school is now allowing students without quirks to enter its hero program and I still want to at least try. It's just that. Is that all? Sounds like a simple fix. Izuku Midoriya's head whipped up so fast he might have given himself whiplash, staring at Ryoko with hope beaming in his eyes. Really? He said in a skeptical tone. Sure. Just, what's a quirk? Midoriya's face slammed into the earth while Ryoko gave out an awkward laugh. Really, he should have guessed this. A quirk is what we here on Earth call a superpower, explained the green-haired teen as he pulled himself off the ground. Like with that sludge villain, his quirk allows him to do stuff like that. My dad's quirk lets him breathe fire and my mom can levitate things. But me, I was born without one. Do you think you can help me with that? Or maybe teach me how to use your space weapons? Ryoko hummed for a moment. No idea, she said with a laugh, causing the teen to slam his face into the ground once more. But you know the galaxy is a big place. I'm sure I'll figure out something. Midoriya looked up to see Ryoko giving him a thumbs up and not noticing the piece of sludge moving away from them. 2 weeks later, Izuku collapsed onto his bed, staring up at the ceiling with a near-dead expression while his backpack fell to the floor. His red shoes were still on, messing up his All Might sheets. But right now, he didn't care. Not after the day he had. Oh, who was he kidding? The last couple of weeks had been a nightmare that never seemed to end. Honestly, he thought things would have been better. After Ryoko had left, getting to watch a real-life spaceship from another planet lift off, Izuku had stumbled through the forest all night and a good part of the morning before the heroes found him. They had questioned him about the sludge villain, trying to figure out where he was before returning the teen to his mother who had been worried sick. That hadn't been so bad. Heck, even the heroes told his mother that Izuku had been brave to push through everything and keep working to find a way home despite his quirklessness. The nightmare, however, started when he had gotten back to school. There, no one cared that he had been kidnapped. In fact, many thought it was pathetic that someone who dreamed of being a hero would allow himself to be taken. That if he was so useless as to not be able to keep his own neck safe, then how would he be able to protect anyone else? And the leader of this group was, of course, Kaken. His former friend turned bully amped up his abuse, both verbal and physical, to the point where it felt like the entire school was now mocking him for having a dream. The teachers, well, Izuku wasn't sure if they were clueless about what was really going on or if they just didn't care. This depression lasted for only a few moments before Izuku began to psyche himself up. He knew he couldn't let them drag him down. And he had the perfect way to cheer himself up, his favorite All Might video. Seeing that scene of the #1 hero saving people with a smile on his face, letting everyone know that things were going to be alright because he was there. What sort of person wouldn't be cheered up from seeing a scene so heroic? As Izuku began to turn in his bed, the green-haired teen froze when he saw something sticking out of his wall. Or, rather, someone. It was Ryoko, smiling and waving at him while sticking out at a horizontal angle from the wall, defying gravity. What's more, there was an adorable creature that looked like a cross between a rabbit and a cat sitting on the top of her head. This creature had grayish-brown fur, large yellow eyes, and a red gem in the middle of its forehead. When it saw that Izuku was looking at them, the rabbit-cat thing began to jump up and down, causing its large ears to flop about before mimicking a wave with one of its furry paws. It took a moment for Izuku to process this, and when he did, he let out a scream. Not because he had forgotten who Ryoko was, oh no. It was because there was a girl in his room. There was an alien in his room. There was an alien girl in his room. Sorry it took so long, said Ryoko as she flew in the room fully, disregarding the screaming as if she were used to it. Now that she was in the room, Izuku saw that she was wearing a blue dress with yellow stripes running from side to side. Once she had landed, she began reaching into one of her sleeves and began to fish for something. But you wouldn't believe how hard it was to find something that would help you. I thought about having one of the cat beasts of 𝗵𝗲 bite you and hoping you turned into one, but the folks there said I had just watched too many cheesy movies. Then I tried to get you a nanite injection, but hauling all of that across the galaxy would have been a pain. I mean, just getting the tank out of a lab would have been trouble without breaking down a few dozen walls and, well, it might not have survived, not to mention all the other gear I'd need to get. I almost decided on just getting you a few weapons that would put the most advanced ones on this planet to shame until I heard about this baby. As if on cue, Ryoko pulled out an object that seemed almost unremarkable. It looked like a silver pen with caps on both ends. What is it? Asked Izuku as he scooted off the bed. Well, according to the people I beat up and stole this from, it's supposed to allow one to transfer traits of one species to another. Why, you stole that? Space pirate. Remember, said Ryoko with a huff and giving Izuku an indignant look. Besides, I don't think it counts since they were part of a terrorist group planning on trying to steal the Jdurei Empire's secrets and causing trouble with Galaxy Police. So, I'd say it was more like I was giving the police a hand and keeping a little something for myself. She then paused, taking a breath as a smile returned to her face. Gently she lifted herself off the ground and floated over to the younger teen. But anyways, with this, I can give you all of my abilities. Everything I can do, you'll be able to do as well, making you as much of a powerhouse as me. Izuku's eyes widened at that. He had witnessed what she was capable of. With the quirks, no, powers Ryoko had, he stood a chance, a real good chance at getting a new at becoming a hero. One that could save lives with a smile on his face just like All Might. Hold on there, don't get too excited, said Ryoko suddenly, drawing Izuku out of his thoughts. Ryoko then held the device up, and when she spoke next there was a level of seriousness that he had never heard her use before. I'm willing to use this device to give you all of my powers, but once I do that there will be no going back. You'll never be able to go back to being a human. Or, at least, a full one. So, are you sure you want this? Midoriya only eyed the device once more. His eyes narrowed in determination as he nodded. Midoriya found himself running through the forest. Though it wasn't the same one from the sludge villain incident. The trees and paths were far more familiar to him, as this was the same place he used to go when he was little. Back when he followed his former friend Kaken everywhere, even when the signs told him not to. How long had it been since he had last been here? Since he was 4, 5 or 6. It was hard to recall. The forest had not changed all that much, but the red shoes that hit the ground were. They were larger, holding up a boy now dressed in a green jogging suit as he ran through the trees, jumping over rocks and fallen branches towards his goal while his lungs burned. That goal being the alien woman known as Ryoko. Dressed in her casual blue dress, the space pirate flew backwards in front of him, arms behind her back as she kept the same distance between them at all times with a grin on her face. Somehow she seemed to be aware of her surroundings, swaying back and forth to avoid the scattered trees. She also seemed to just teleport back and forth, like the weight on a pendulum. Every time she would do this, Izuku would correct his course ever so slightly so that she was right in front of him. Sweat began to coat Izuku's face, but he continued to run after the flying teen in front of him while his mind raced. He had been at this pace for the last 10 minutes, just chasing after her with no other clear idea on how he was supposed to reach her. But there had to be a way, something he could do to close the gap. He had already tried giving everything he had right out of the starting gate, only to find himself quickly winded with her easily adjusting her own speed. Perhaps if he tried to suddenly sprint after her he could catch her off guard. That might be possible, as she might not suspect something like that given the state he was in. Or maybe he could use one of the trees, leaping onto one and launching off of it in a cool and heroic fashion. That was an option, except for the fact that he didn't know how to do that, or how much distance it would give him, meaning he would be expending a large amount of energy for something that might not be worth it, or how to land. Looking like she had suddenly become bored with this, Ryoko held out an open palm in front of her. Izuku's eyes widened as he saw the red energy she created pooling in her hand. Then, with a sweeping motion, she flung the orb towards the tired teen without so much as a word. Izuku saw it coming. leaping to the side in order to dodge, and turned his head to watch as the orb zoomed past him. "Where the hell are you looking?" came a sudden shout mixed with anger and annoyance. A moment later, Izuku felt a now very familiar sensation of Ryoko's fist being slammed into his gut, hitting him with enough force to send him flying off the ground. From there he flew backwards briefly before falling and landing onto his back to stare up at the forest canopy above him. Wincing and panting in pain, Izuku thought back to a few days ago. Flashback. "So you're telling me this woman can help you get a quirk," said 𝗏𝐽 Midoriya slowly. Her eyes narrowed slightly in clear distrust as she sat at her seat at the dinner table, squirming in his chair directly across from her. Izuku nodded while keeping his head down slightly as beads of sweat ran down his face. One of the first problems Izuku realized he would have to face after he had accepted Ryoko's help was his mother. More specifically, how would he explain all this to her? After all, this was his mother. She was the only family that he knew of living in Japan. The idea that he could just walk up to her saying, "I just woke up with a quirk after all these years," and not of her be suspicious was doubtful at best. Nor would it help explain why he wanted Ryoko to live with them in their apartment. Sure, Ryoko had a spaceship and could, potentially, live there. But seeing as how she's giving him her powers and was helping him to become a hero, it didn't feel right to leave her isolated and alone. The least he could do was offer her a place to stay here on Earth, along with free meals. And judging by the way Ryoko's mouth watered at the suggestion, it seemed she liked the idea as well. So before they headed out the door of his room, the two came up with a simple plan: tell the truth. After all, there was no real reason to lie to her, which might make things more complicated down the road. The only thing they were going to leave out was that Ryoko was an alien. That piece of information might be a little too much for 𝗏𝐽 to believe or even process. Heck, if Izuku hadn't literally seen the crashing spacecraft, he doubted he would have believed it as well. It was only now, as he sat at the table with Ryoko next to him, that he realized that the truth still sounded suspicious, not helped by what Ryoko had decided to wear. Glancing at the space pirate, Izuku couldn't help but wince at the oversized lab coat she was sporting over her blue dress with her name scribbled onto the coat pocket in marker. She was also wearing comically thick glasses that looked like they came from the bottom of old soda bottles with rings in them. On her head was the rabbit creature, Ryo-Oki, who was also wearing the same glasses ... for some reason. Where had they gotten all that? "Don't worry, Mrs. Midoriya. I can totally help your son get a quirk," said Ryoko, her voice carefree as she waved a hand in the air. "All with the power of science and crap." As she spoke, more sweat began to form on Izuku's face as he saw his mother's lips tighten into a thin line. "I see," said 𝗏𝐽 slowly. Her narrow eyes focused on Ryoko for several long seconds as they oozed distrust. Slowly they moved up to her head, staring at Ryo-Oki, who was now stoking her chin as if there were a beard there, before lowering it back to Ryoko. Then she sighed before looking over at her son, her gaze gentler yet holding a firm seriousness. "Izuku, I knew you were desperate, but this is too much." "But Mom," began Izuku, only to be stopped by a look from the small woman. "I'm sorry, Izuku, but this is something you need to accept." There was a pause as 𝗏𝐽 took a deep breath. "Izuku ... we've done everything possible. Every legitimate doctor I have spoken to has said the same thing. If your quirk hasn't appeared by now, it never will. Your father and I have even looked at some old gene therapies that were going on in America back in the day, but they were discontinued. Do you know why? Because nothing worked. You can't give someone something they never had in the first place." 𝗏𝐽 paused again to let out another sigh. "Izuku, I'm sorry. I love you with all my heart, but I'm not going to let this snake oil salesman get your hopes up with fake promises of getting a quirk. So, please escort this crazy woman out of our home, because she is not getting her greedy hands on any of our money." Like I wanted it in the first place," stated Ryoko as she stood up. As a worried Izuku looked up at her, waving his hands in the air in complete panic, Ryoko took hold of the lab coat and discarded it, as well as the glasses. Even Ryo-Oki did the same. Once free of the disguise, Ryoko placed a foot on the table with her hands on her waist. "You can keep the money. It's completely worthless to me. All I want is a nice bed and 3, maybe 4, square meals a day." 𝗏𝐽 blinked. "What? You heard me," stated Ryoko loudly. She then leaned forward a bit, bringing her head closer to 𝗏𝐽's. "And that's only if he gets a quirk. If he doesn't, then you can do whatever. Kick me out of the apartment with a broom, call the police, or whatever else you want." For a few minutes, Izuku sat there as he watched the scene unfolding before him. His mother was silent, her gaze never leaving Ryoko's. It was as if they were having either a staring contest or having some telepathic conversation. The only movement he could see came from his mother, lightly chewing her tongue from time to time. Finally, she pulled back a little from Ryoko and looked at her son. "Polite, I'll let you try this. But, when it doesn't work, I want this to be over. No more talking about becoming a hero. You move on with your life. Is that understood?" "Yes," came Izuku's response, nodding as he did so. Well, now that that's settled, said Ryoko as she sat back down in her seat while fishing out the device once more. Izuku glanced at the device once more before turning to look at her mother. It was clear that she wasn't impressed, looking as if she were trying to keep her eyes from rolling, until they widened in shock. Izuku quickly turned to look back, seeing the device was now floating between them with several floating screens around it, each one the size of a sticky note with text zooming across them at speeds impossible for him to read. The green-haired teen was about to ask what was happening, only to be stopped as he felt something prick his arm. Looking down, he spotted a small hole in the sleeve of his uniform which now showed his skin. He looked up to Ryoko, seeing that she had already pulled up her own sleeve, revealing her smooth, bare arm. Then it happened. Blood began to flow out from her arm, suspended in the air as if it traveled through an invisible tube towards the device. The alien machine accepted the gift, allowing it to pass through it, before it flowed through to the other side and towards Izuku. The only thing Izuku could do was stare as the blood made its way toward him, making his body its new home while his mother's arms waved around frantically while fear etched her face. Shocked, Izuku felt something as the blood entered into him, causing the teen to take a deep intake of breath. A weird feeling came over him before something far more familiar began to take over, one he felt every time Kaken used his quirk on him. Burning. Only now, he felt like the fire was inside of him, moving through his veins like a wildfire. Speaking of his veins, he could now see that they were visible on his hand. All of them clear as day, and he had a feeling that more could be seen than that. As more blood entered into his body, Izuku's head began to pound as if explosions were going on inside of it. He wanted to cry out, but the pain was silencing him. The burning and the pounding only seemed to get worse and worse until finally he thankfully passed out. The light of the sun shining through the window was what awoke Izuku. The teen groaned a little, raising a hand up in order to shield his eyes from the light of the sun. At first his eyes were open just a crack, taking in the familiar surroundings around him. His All Might blanket was wrapped around his body. The All Might posters were all smiling at him, and even his collection of All Might figures were posed to face his bed. Everything seemed normal, except for him. He couldn't explain it, but he felt different. The best way he could describe it was that he was a plate of scrambled eggs that someone had added bits of chopped bacon before mixing it all together. As he thought about this analogy, something caught his attention. His index finger had small, green currents of electricity dancing around it. The sight caused his eyes to grow wide in panic, a scream escaping his lip as he bolted upright. Before he knew what he was doing, his opposite hand had taken a hold of the other's wrist so that the hand was held up. Izuku stared at the lightning as pressure began to build inside of the digit. "Izuku, my baby, what's happening?" came his mother's voice, the door bursting open as a panicked 𝐭𝐽 raced inside. As she did, a thin beam of green light shot from Izuku's finger so suddenly that it scared his mother into falling on her hands and knees. The beam struck the ceiling, doing little more than singeing it. For a moment, neither of the two said or did anything. They just stared at the finger as a thin wisp of smoke rose from the tip, something that only lasted for 2 to 3 heartbeats. Then, slowly, a smile began to form on Izuku's lips, followed by tears. A sob escaped him, but the smile never faded. He could feel his tears running down his face, slow at first, but, as his mother embraced him with a hug, they became like twin waterfalls to which 𝐭𝐽 quickly joined in. He knew, without looking, that she was crying the same as him, both shedding tears that had nothing to do with the usual feelings of pain, suffering, disappointment, and so forth that they had experienced for too long. No, these were tears full of unimaginable joy and happiness that no force on earth could quell until they became completely dehydrated and needed Ryoko to force gallons of water down their throats. Finally, Izuku Midoriya had a quirk. Sort of. Breakfast that day was one of the happiest that the Midoriya family had known for some time, with 𝐭𝐽 making all of her son's favorite dishes one after another without a care or concern to how much it would cost. She became like a busy bee, moving from the rice cooker to the stove, all to make sure that this celebration would be one that they would always remember. As soon as the dishes were ready, they were placed on the table with a proud flourish for Izuku and Ryoko to eat. And speaking of Ryoko, "All right, now that you have my powers, it's time to get to work," she said between large mouthfuls of rice that she shoveled into her mouth. Next to her was Ryo-Oki, sitting in front of a large plate of carrots and going through them faster than her owner's own food, in order to use them to their fullest. "Wow, this rice is amazing. You're going to need to get into shape. The stronger you get, the better off you'll be." But, she paused to take a bite out of a buttery pancake. "Just so you know, I'm going to be tough as hell. Oh, can I have seconds on my rice?" "Coming up," said 𝐭𝐽 happily, levitating the bowl with her quirk into the air where it then floated towards where the plump woman was standing. With a hum, she filled Ryoko's bowl before floating it back to her. "I'm glad Earth Food agrees with you so much." That comment nearly caused Izuku to choke on his food as panic filled him. He managed to swallow as he looked over to the chubby woman as new beads of sweat began to form. "Ah, Earth Food. Haha, that's an odd thing to say. It's not like she an alien or something." 𝐭 turned to look at her son, a frown appearing on her face for the first time that morning. "Give your mother a little credit," she said, her voice indignant as if she had just been insulted while her hands went to her hips. "I've sat by you as you watched all the latest hero news and listened to you spout off all sorts of hero facts for years. I was bound to pick up a few things, like hero gear. So I think I have a good idea when I see something that is well above what some of the top heroes use out there." A small, embarrassed smile then appeared on 𝐭's face. "And I may have overreacted a little after you passed out." Ryoko let out a laugh. "She tried to hit me 3 times. Stunned, Izuku looked over at Ryoko, who began shoveling food back into her mouth. "The only way I could calm her down was by explaining everything." "Oh," was all Izuku could say, leaning back in his chair as he stared in front of him with big eyes and his pupils becoming nothing more than tiny dots. And here he thought she'd be more freaked out that aliens existed. "Izuku, you'd better finish your food quickly or else you'll be late for school," 𝐭 said, gesturing at the clock. But despite that, she didn't turn down the temperature of the stove, instead placing several carrots on a plate which she brought to Ryoko. Upon replacing the plate with a fresh one, the small creature let out a meow of joy as it jumped up and down into the air before beginning to devour everything before it saved the plate. And 𝐭 stood there, petting Ryoko with a smile on her face before returning to the stove. "School?" asked Ryoko as she leaned back in her seat. "Why the heck does he need that if he wants to bust heads for a living? Fat lot of good math and warp theory are going to do him. Besides, if he goes then there will be less time to get him into shape." "Ah, we don't study warp theory in junior high," muttered Izuku, sweat dropping as he looked at Ryoko. "I don't even think students in college really study it." "Ryoko, a lot of people want to go into the hero business," said 𝐭, turning from the stove again after turning down the heat on the burners. "It's highly competitive, and the top schools around the world only want the best of the best. So if Izuku really has his heart set on UA, the best hero school there is, then he's going to need to make sure he stands out. There'll no doubt be a written exam he'll have to take as well as testing his quirk." Both of the Midoriyas sighed as Ryoko then shrugged, seeming unconcerned. Yet despite this, 𝐭's smile had not vanished, diminished a bit, but it was still there as she pulled out her phone. "I think I'm going to need to take a personal day." A half hour later, Izuku left the apartment with his stomach fuller than it had ever been in his life. But before he closed the door, he could hear his mother and Ryoko still in the kitchen as they went back and forth on what they thought the best schedule for him would be. Something that seemed to take longer than either of them realized as they were still working on it when Izuku got home. Both of them seemed to go back and forth, trying to map out each day so that Izuku would get the most well-rounded training possible with time for study and recovery taken into account. One thing that his mother flat out refused to make any concession on was that the week before and during his exams were off limits. In return, Ryoko got full reign over Izuku's life during breaks or a cancellation of a school day for whatever reason. Once this had been agreed upon, the two went over the little details, writing everything onto the calendar for all to see, right up to the point when he went to bed. And flashback since then. Izuku had been put through the paces just like Ryoko promised. However, he was a bit confused by her workout regimen, tying him up with a rope before tossing him off a cliff so he could climb back up, making him climb trees with his bare hands, carrying large buckets of water up a steep hill, and sitting on his stomach as he did reverse push-ups. All this felt like the crazy stuff one would find in a cheesy, martial arts manga. Then came the fight training which, well, wasn't going very well as he had only learned 2 things so far. The first was that Ryoko could hit harder than 𝐭. The other was just how well her powers seemed to suit her profession as he had gotten a good look at all of them. The phasing, teleporting, and flying made it so that, no matter the situation, she had options to get into whatever she wanted. There seemed to be no place that was out of bounds for her, if she ever got caught or had to fight. The energy orbs that she threw could do an insane amount of damage if she wanted, while her finger beams were used for small, more precise attacks. Then there was the sword. Footsteps came racing towards Izuku as he pushed himself off the ground. By the time he got into a sitting position, his mother was next to him with Ryoko on her head. Both looked deeply concerned. "I don't get it," said Ryoko as she teleported in front of Izuku, floating several feet above him with her arms crossed in front of her chest. Looking up, Izuku could see the look of annoyance. No, that wasn't right. Maybe confusion. "Look at you. All that talk about getting into a hero school. And it feels like you haven't worked out a day in your life. Please tell me you weren't planning on entering and just hoping for the best." "Ryoko," snapped 𝐭 as Izuku looked towards the ground in embarrassment. "It's not," he began, his hands clutching at the grass and dirt that surrounded him. "It's not like I didn't want to. I wanted to get into a fitness program ... but the gyms, their insurance doesn't cover the quirkless, so I was turned away." And, well, personal workout equipment can get a little expensive beyond simple hand weights. As he finished, Izuku looked up to see that Ryoko's expression had hardened. Not just that, but he could see that she had tightened her grip on her arms while a fire seemed to blaze in her eyes. The sight nearly made the teen flinch in terror, afraid that she might begin yelling and screaming at him. But, before he could, her expression softened as she looked away. Well, she began as she scratched the back of her head. After a moment or two she looked back down at the boy with a smile. Guess that means I'll have to work you extra hard on our days, now won't I? After cracking her neck a few times, Ryoko let out a laugh that caused Izuku's blood to run a little cold. But, regardless, he stood up anyway, ready to begin again. Ryoko, are you sure that's best? Asked 𝗏𝗏 as Ryoko turned, floating back where she had been. I just think you might be going a little too tough on him right now. Couldn't you maybe go a bit easier on Izuku since he's just starting out? Start gradual and work his way up. For a moment, Ryoko just floated there while letting out a long hum. Then, when she turned around, they saw she was still smiling. Only this time, it felt like a mix between devilish and playful, something that was also reflected in her eyes. Well, I can either go hard on him now so that he can be more prepared when he faces real challenges, or I can go easy on him and let him face those hard challenges on his own when his life is on the line. Izuku gulped at Ryoko's words as he felt his mother suddenly grip his arm. He could feel her shaking with fear. And, if he was being honest, a part of him was shaking as well. But that part was small as the majority of his being understood the weight behind her words. The world of heroes was not some walk in the park and he would be facing danger every day. That there would be risks. But here, right now, Ryoko could put him through hell and back as she trained him while making sure he still came home in one piece. Something that would not happen later on. Not only that, but he had to play catch up to all the others trying to get into UA. People who had been using their quirks far longer than him. And he had no idea how tough, how brutal the entrance exam was going to be. So the tougher the training, the better. Looking down at his mother, Izuku saw that she too was beginning to understand that as well. Slowly, she let go of her son and nodded so that Izuku's training from hell could continue. All right, all set up, said Izuku, wiping away a small amount of sweat from his brow as he stood up. With a small smile of pride he took a few steps back in the mostly empty room he was currently in so that he was now standing next to Ryoko. The space teen had been waiting for the last half hour with a hand under her chin and a neutral expression on her face, watching her new young partner as he worked. Slowly, carefully, Izuku looked over to her with hope in his eyes. So, do you like it? No, said Ryoko, her answer almost making Izuku cry if not for her sudden teleportation. When she had reappeared, she was now laying in the hammock Izuku had just finished with her arms outstretched as if she were in the middle of a cheer. I love it. Izuku let out a weak chuckle as he watched Ryoko place her hands behind her head, closing her eyes, growing more comfortable in her new room. Located at the end of the hallway, next to his mother's bedroom, this room had, for the longest time, been nothing more than a place used for extra storage as well as a guest room. But now it had finally found a permanent resident in Ryoko as part of the deal Izuku's mother had made. It had been interesting to watch as Ryoko seemed surprised when they had begun cleaning it out, taken aback that she wasn't just being given the couch by the smaller plump woman. Even more so when she was asked to bear with a traditional futon bed until she could go out and get one similar to the ones she and Izuku used. Blushing and waving her arms in front of her, Ryoko flat out refused, saying that she would get something herself. What she had gotten, from somewhere, was the hammock that Izuku had just finished installing. Are you sure you don't want anything else? Asked Izuku. No, this is good. The answer made Izuku wince a little as he looked around what he could barely refer to as a bedroom at the moment. There was a desk by the window which had been his father's when he still lived here. But other than that in the hammock, there was nothing. There were no dressers for her clothing, which had just been dropped in a small pile in the corner of the room. No vanity mirror, pictures on the wall, or any personal possessions that Ryoko had brought with her. Like the place had no identity that said, like All Might, I am here. The lone exception was a small wicker basket with a pillow in it by the desk, a pet bed for Ryo-Oki. The small alien rabbit, cat or cabbit, had leapt for joy when seeing this before running circles on the pillow as she happily meowed before finally falling asleep with a carrot held in its paws. Well, if you're sure, said Izuku slowly. He watched for a moment before shaking his head. If she was happy with this, then he wasn't going to force her. Oh, Izuku, how's your mom holding up? Asked Ryoko suddenly, opening a single eye to look at him. She looked a little out of it when I saw her last. She's fine, said Izuku as he sat down cross-legged with his back against the wall. Just nervous about going to the quirk registration office too. Well, help me register your powers as my quirk. To be honest, I was nervous too. Ryoko let out an irritated noise before closing her eyes. Must be a big deal around here. I saw her packing her purse with a lot of money. Izuku blinked at that, having never noticed or seen his mother doing anything like that. I guess she must have thought that she might have to bribe someone in the office, he said as he looked at the floor, head held low. It makes sense. As far as I know, my mom's only been there twice. Once to register her quirk and the other when I found out I was quirkless. So we really didn't know how they would react to me suddenly changing my status. Is that so? Said Ryoko, her voice now lighter. Happy even. Looking up, Izuku saw that Ryoko had rolled over to her side, head resting in the palm of her hand as she looked at the teen with a mix of playfulness and danger. Well then, I have the perfect offer for you. I can break into this building no problem and change it for you. Why, I'd even be willing to find whoever tried to blackmail your mom and send him straight to. No, 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 yelled Izuku quickly, waving his hands in front of him as he interrupted Ryoko. Sweat was pouring down his face. It's fine, really. Nobody was blackmailed. He then took a breath, relaxing a great deal as he looked at the alien woman. It turns out stuff like this is pretty common. I didn't even need to use any of the 15 cover stories I had prepared since my mom told me we were going. All I needed to do was fill out a form and explain what my quirk did. Didn't even give us a fine or anything. Well, this time at least. They said that the first change is free, but after this there will be a fee that increases every time I have to come back. Damn, said Ryoko with a pout, rolling over so that now she was looking up at the ceiling with her hands behind her head. I was hoping to have a little fun. Oh well. She then glanced back at Izuku. So, what did you register your quirk as? I thought a lot about it, said Izuku, his eyes brightening as he got on his favorite topic. Perhaps even more so now since it now included him. There was a lot to go over. With all the various powers you have, I had to consider one that could explain all of them. But after going over all of my hero notebooks, checking the hero news over the years, and even looking up some older heroes, I decided that energy manipulation would be the most believable option. Though, came Ryoko's response, urging him to explain. The way I explained it is this. I manipulate my own body's energy in different ways, like taking the energy to generate the blast that comes from my finger or gathering it into my hand in order to create a more powerful explosive force. It would also explain how I would be able to teleport or phase through objects. Simply turning my entire being into energy that vibrates at a different frequency than the matter around me would allow me to phase while dispersing the energy and recombining it at another location would explain the teleportation. As for flight, well, I guess that can be explained by either me creating a personalized energy field that allows me to defy gravity or something between teleportation and phasing. Oh, and if they had asked, I could have used this as the perfect excuse as to why my quirk took so long to emerge. That most of my body's energy was needed to help me grow and so it concentrated on that. Not bad, said Ryoko, a small smile appearing on her face as she spoke in a slightly sing-song voice. That might actually work out well for you. But that explanation on how you got your quirk might come back to bite you in the long run. Izuku blinked at that. But, look, I don't get this whole quirk thing but I heard you went to the doctor to see if you got a quirk, said Ryoko, her smile now gone and glancing over at Izuku with a single eye. Your cover story might fool most people, but not all. There might be that one person who will ask why the doc didn't notice this. Izuku felt his heart stop when he heard this. He hadn't thought of that. Then, you'll have to come up with another lie to explain that. Then another and another until the whole house of cards comes tumbling down upon you. Take it from me, these things always come back to bite you one way or another. Best to go with the truth. Or, at least, a modified version of it. That could work, muttered Izuku as he brought a hand to his chin, his gaze returning to the floor as he began to push out his thoughts. Mom did say that she looked into gene therapy to see if I could get a quirk. Perhaps there are a few out there, just not getting the funding or attention that they used to get, seeing as now 80% of the public has quirks. If anyone asked, I could say that I was part of a gene therapy, and that I was the only one to get a quirk. Then Izuku frowned. But won't people still ask questions? Like who was behind this project? This feels like it would be some sort of major news. That's when you follow up with, I don't know, said Ryoko with a slight laugh. Just say it was already poorly funded and you just so happened to stumble upon it figuring might as well give it a try. Which, for the record, you did. Then just say that before your quirk manifested, the project was closed. Again, true. You have no way of contacting the doctor though you wish to give her your undying thanks by going with her into space and living the life of a pirate. I don't think I'll say that last part, stated Izuku, a deadpan expression on his face. He then let out a tired sigh. Both cover stories have their flaws, but it makes more sense than saying I'm just a late bloomer who got multiple quirks or something like that. Hey, you do what you feel like, said Ryoko with a wave of her hand. I'm just offering my opinion as a known pirate. Not long after this, 𝐭 called the two of them for lunch. Ryoko grinned with giddiness at this, teleporting away without another word while Izuku got to his feet to walk out of the room with an excited Ryo-Oki at his heels. As he entered the kitchen, his eyes went to the calendar that would be dictating his life for at least the next 10 months. On it, both his mother and Ryoko had placed in what they had agreed upon on the days prior. Izuku could clearly make out his mother's neat, legible handwriting in blue detailing the times when she wanted him to focus on his studies as well as what types of meals she had planned for the day. It honestly made him smile more than he thought it would, looking at the days labeled high-carb day or high-protein day. On the other hand, Ryoko's handwriting in red was done in a sloppy fashion, with multiple parts crossed off as she forgot to write down Quirk training, something they needed in case guests came over. Turning his head to the table, the green-haired teen spotted Ryoko standing in front of the seat next to his own. In her hand was a teacup with her name printed along the side, which she stared at, as if trying to figure out what it was. Or was she trying to? Is something wrong with the cup? Asked 𝗏 as she began to set the table, looking slightly worried at the alien girl. At her words, Ryoko jumped as if she had suddenly become spooked by something, nearly tossing the cup against the ceiling in the process. Thankfully, it didn't connect and Ryoko caught it with ease as it fell back down. No, it's, she began, slowly looking confused for a moment as she looked at Mrs. Midoriya. This is ... for me. Her tone nearly made Izuku trip. It sounded almost hopeful. Of course, said 𝗏, who blinked in confusion. You're a member of this household now. With that, 𝗏 went back to setting the table as if the matter was settled. As for Ryoko, she stared at the cup for a moment longer before sitting back down in an almost passive silence, something that didn't last long as food was soon placed before her. Oh yeah, Ryoko cried, her chopsticks in the air after taking her first bite of the meal. Her eyes were closed, her face looking like she was savoring the taste of the food for as long as possible, before wolfing down everything in front of her like it was the first time she had something to eat in weeks. I tell you, for a planet all the way out in the boonies, the food here is top rate. 𝗏 smiled at the praise from across the table, eating her own meal with far more restraint than Ryoko or her son. Oh, you're just saying that, said the older woman with a light blush. No, I'm serious, said Ryoko, pausing to take a long gulp of her tea. Now that I know about this, I can't tell anyone or else the entire galaxy will be parking up in orbit just to get some. Well, my mom is a great cook, said Izuku after swallowing a mouthful of his own meal with a loud gulp. The comment made the older woman blush a bit more, but stopped when she noticed that Izuku was now looking curiously at Ryoko. I've been meaning to ask, is it really okay for you to be eating Earth food like this? I mean, Ryoko waved him off, picking up more food with her chopsticks. Hey, don't worry about it, she said with a laugh. We have rice and stuff like this all over the galaxy. Nothing I haven't had before. A curious look then appeared on Ryoko's face, a hand going to her chin as she used her chopsticks to bring up some of her meal closer to her face. It's a bit strange though. I've had similar dishes on other planets before and none of them ever tasted this good. Ryoko then shrugged before tossing the food into her mouth. Oh well, let's get our fill and then we can start today's training. Izuku nodded as he went back to his meal, knowing that he would need all the energy he could get. While 𝗏 was more focused on the mental awareness of her son as well as his nutrition, Ryoko set her sights on the physical aspects that Izuku would need. This included training his body to make it as physically fit as possible, teaching him how to fight, and teaching him how to use his new powers whenever they showed up. In order to do all this, Ryoko had taken time out of the day in order to find the best spots for each type of training that they would need. Most of the time, they stayed in the woods where the terrain was versatile enough to get the results Ryoko wanted. But, for more specific types of training, she felt a change of scenery was needed, such as the case right now. What you have right now is the equivalent to a baby's first crawl, said Ryoko, her voice just loud enough to be heard over the crashing waves of the beach they were on as she set empty cans and bottles on top of a refrigerator that was on its side. Her words caused Izuku to deflate almost instantly, his head lowering a bit as he looked around the area for today's training. It was a section of the beach that had, more than likely, been just another part of the seemingly endless blanket of sand and water that stretched on for as far as the eyes could see. But, thanks to the currents, this part of the beach had become the eyesore of it all. Trash kept washing up onto the shore seemingly from all over the world as he could spot the faded images of flags of other countries on some of the smaller items as well as words written in different languages. Izuku had also heard that some people took advantage of this, dumping their own trash here in the dead of night. Since nobody came here, it seemed like the ideal place to do target practice. But, began Izuku, only to stop himself as he looked down at his index finger. He stared at it for a bit as a bolt or two danced around the digit, but nothing more before finally looking up. Ryoko had finished setting up the target, moving back towards him with pure confidence. Yes, the bean can hurt, but not that much, continued Ryoko, holding up her own index finger and waving it. Now that she was closer, Izuku could now hear the tone of her voice all the clearer. It was firm, but in a way that told him that Ryoko wasn't telling him all this to put him down. Rather, she was bringing him back to reality so that he could improve. All with a slim smile. Most of the time, my people use it to scare off small rodents and destroy small objects, she continued, red sparks now appearing around her own finger. She then turned to face the targets, pointing at the first and firing a red beam of light. In less than a second, a bottle exploded, sending shards flying upwards in every direction. At best, that'll be all you can hope for. Oh, said a slightly dejected Izuku, shoulders slumping. He had hoped that he could make it more powerful, something that would be better suited for hero work, since he had first awoken with this ability. He had been writing in a separate notebook with theories on what he might be able to use it for. Now, he feared that most of it, if not all, were useless. Hey, don't look so down, said Ryoko, regaining Izuku's attention. Sure, it might not pack a wallop, but it does have its uses, like causing a distraction or just annoying your opponent. And with enough skill, her words trailed off, her wrist flipping so her palm was up and finger extended. The next thing Izuku knew was that a red beam had been fired at his leg. Feeling like he had received a powerful kick there, the green-haired teen reached down to grab it, only for his head to be met with Ryoko's fist halfway down. The blow was strong enough so that Izuku was flipped backwards, landing on his back. Why? He asked, staring up in the blue sky above before Ryoko's smirking face filled his vision. I'm more of a hands-on type of gal, she said, her face taking on a bit of a Cheshire grin. Helps drive home the point I'm trying to make. Now come on, we need to start practicing. With a small groan, Izuku managed to roll over before getting on all fours. As he stood, a smile appeared on his face as excitement flowed through his veins at getting a literal first-hand look at how he could use this new power he had received. Sure, there was a part of him that felt indigent towards Ryoko for showing him that move in the most villainous of ways. Yet that part of him was quickly overshadowed by his drive to become a hero, which rationalized her actions. When he became a hero, villains would take cheap shots like that at him all the time. So he had to get used to it now so he would be better prepared for it in the future. Plus, now that he knew what it felt like firsthand, he could begin coming up with his own uses for it. Also, Ryoko was a space pirate, so for the next 10 minutes or so, Izuku went to work on target practice while Ryoko watched from behind, leaning against an old, rusty car with her hands behind her head. During that time, Izuku's heart sank lower with each green beam that flew from his finger. Part of this was because, now that he had seen Ryoko using her own finger beam, he couldn't help but compare the two. It felt like she could fire them instantly without much effort, while he had to wait. While that was both annoying and frustrating, it was nothing compared to the other problem that no one on Earth could fail to notice as the green streaks of energy flew through the air. He was missing his targets. Badly. What am I doing wrong? Izuku mumbled to himself after a while, looking down at his finger with a frown. Is it because my arm is shaking a little because I'm nervous? That is a possibility. But it could also be caused by a slight arm strain from holding my arm straight for so long while I wait for the blast to charge. Or is there some sort of recoil that I'm not seeing? Something so small that I'm not even realizing it? You're right about the arm, interrupted Ryoko, silencing Izuku as his face turned red with embarrassment and his shoulders to scrunch up. But I'd say your arm is swaying slightly, not shaking. He was about to turn around to say something, but was stopped when he felt Ryoko pressing her chest onto his back. The green-haired teen's heart nearly exploded out from his chest at this, his entire body turning scarlet. Sweat then began to roll down his face as he felt her hand touch his wrist and her breath close to his ear. We're going to try something a little different, she whispered, thankfully not in her playful voice. If she had, Izuku felt certain that his vision would have begun to spin. Instead, she used a more calming voice that snapped him mostly back into attention. Keep your arm down while you charge up your finger. Then, when you are ready, point at your target and release. Izuku nodded, already feeling the lightning bolts dancing around his finger. He took several deep breaths as he felt the pressure in his finger grow. Once he felt like he was ready, Izuku lifted his hand with Ryoko still holding onto his wrist. He fired, closing his eyes as he did so and waited for the sound of a can or bottle breaking. But no noise came, causing him to slump. Better, came Ryoko's voice, causing Izuku to quickly open his eyes. He looked ahead at his target, an old can that looked like it was slightly singed on its side. He had only grazed it. Not really, muttered Izuku as he turned to look at Ryoko just in time to see her cock an eyebrow. Quickly, Izuku began to wave his hands in front of him as he tried to explain himself. I mean, it's just that ... Well, you see. Izuku, said Ryoko as she stepped in front of him, now standing between the green-haired teen and the targets. You're still coming into your powers and learning how to use them. Remember, you just learned how to crawl, so you're bound to fall on your stomach more than once. Just keep working on it and, eventually, you'll be able to do. With a sweeping gesture of her hand, Ryoko sent several beams at the targets which destroyed all of them. That's amazing. shouted a wide-eyed Izuku as he took a step forward. "How were you able to fire so quickly?" I have to wait several seconds before I can charge the beam, but you were able to do it instantly." Ryoko folded her arms across her chest, looking pleased with herself as she closed her eyes and nodded her head. "Yep, I'm pretty amazing," she said before opening a single eye to look at the younger teen. "Just another thing you have to keep working at. You'll get there. Right, let me get some more cans." With a mad dash, Izuku raced out into the dump to collect as many of the discarded cans and bottles as he could carry. Within a few minutes, he returned with at least a dozen or so of them cradled in his arms. For the next half hour, Izuku continued to practice his finger beam with limited success. For the first dozen or so tries he went with Ryoko's method. Doing it like this helped relax his arm a bit between each attack. It was nice, but didn't improve his aim as much as he had hoped, so Izuku decided to switch it up on his own. The green-haired teen spread his legs apart before holding his hand steady by grabbing it at the wrist as his finger charged. While doing this, Izuku found that he could steady himself better. Yet, the issue with his aim hadn't changed much. He was still either missing or simply grazing the targets. Once or twice he had hit them, but trying to duplicate the results ended in failure, causing Izuku to wonder if he had just gotten lucky. Despite the lack of progress, Izuku was, at the very least, thinking about his training. More specifically, making a comparison between what he was doing now and the method Ryoko had shown him. While he had managed to hit at least a couple of his targets like this, he was already feeling a slight strain on his arms that the previous method had not done. Not enough to cause him pain, but just enough to the point where he wanted to lower them for a bit. What's more, if he continued to train like this, wouldn't that make his moves more predictable? As soon as a villain saw him holding his wrist, wouldn't they realize he was about to fire something at them even if they didn't know what it was? Seemed pretty obvious now that he thought about it. But at least this way he could work on his aim until he felt more confident and then could switch to Ryoko's style. But how long would that take? Would he develop a bad habit, form a sort of tell that would give away what he planned to do? If that happened, the sneak attack aspect of what Ryoko had shown him would fly out the window. "That's enough for now," came Ryoko's voice, cutting through Izuku's thoughts like a knife. Izuku blinked as he turned to face her, seeing the alien teen walking over to him with her hands behind her back. "We only have a few hours to jog back to the forest, get some fight training in, and be home in time for dinner. Your mom's making a hot pot." Ryoko licked her lips at that. "So come on, let's get moving." As Ryoko turned towards the path that would lead them out of the piles of junk, Izuku raised a hand. He began, causing the slightly older teen to pause. "Actually, I was thinking that. Couldn't we focus on this for today? Or at least trying to get all of the other powers?" "Well, we could," said Ryoko as she turned to look at her potential partner in crime. "I mean, yeah, we could adjust the schedule so that we spend every single waking moment trying to develop all of the powers sleeping inside of you right now. But then, when the day of the exam comes, you'll end up just like the 𝗂𝗏𝗏. "The 𝗂𝗏𝗏, echoed Izuku, blinking at the name. "What's that?" "It was a ship developed by the GXP several years ago," said Ryoko in a sing-song tone. I remember how much they hyped that thing up. For months, you couldn't tune into any news channel anywhere in the galaxy and not see another interview with one of the top brass praising its development, about how many state-of-the-art weapons they had mounted onto it, the shielding that was second to none, or every idea that was just shoved in there because some nerd they hired thought it would be cool. Countdowns until it launched were put up everywhere, promising when it launched, its sheer might would stop space piracy forever. Well, you can see how well that worked. As she said this last part, Ryoko gave Izuku a wink. What happened? Destroyed on its maiden launch, Ryoko exclaimed with a laugh. Lost to a crew of pirates piloting an old freighter ship that was 2 generations older. Izuku felt his jaw drop and his eyes grow wide. But how? Was all he could say as his mind reeled with what Ryoko was telling him. It was just so hard to believe. It would be like having a modern-day hero losing in a fight with a villain from back when quirks had just started to appear. "Because," said Ryoko as she raised a finger, waving in the air as she spoke, "the pirates knew what they were doing. The crew of the 𝗂𝗏𝗏 were mostly recent graduates from GXP Academy who were still learning their way around the ship. Even the captain was nothing more than a rookie who had never been in combat before except in a simulator. From what I heard, when the attack started they all began to panic. Sure, some of them were doing their best to keep a cool head. But the others, well, some of them were trying to remember which button fired the beam cannons and which turned on the laundry machine on the bridge. Meanwhile, the pirates knew their ship wasn't the fastest, had the best weapons, or even the best shielding, but worked with what they had." Izuku found himself nodding at this. It made sense. No matter how powerful the weapon, even those equipped to a spaceship, would be meaningless if you didn't know how to use them properly. Had this GXP taken a bit more time to train the crew, making sure they all had a better understanding of the 𝗂𝗏𝗏 and its systems, then maybe things would have played out differently. Ryoko paused for a moment as she began to float in the air with her hands behind her head. Look, Izuku, I didn't get to be the most dangerous space pirate in the galaxy on my powers alone. Sure, they helped, but they never would have gotten me as far as I've gone unless I picked up how to fight with them as well as without them. And even less if I didn't have the strength and the stamina to keep going. You're right, said Izuku as he looked at Ryoko. A fire now lit in his eyes as he began to see something for the first time. Something that he had been blinded to for the last several days since gaining this new power. If I want to go to you and become a pro like All Might, then I need to cover as many of my bases as possible. Everyone else will have had 10 years of training their bodies along with their quirks, so I need to. Izuku was suddenly cut off as Ryoko's shoe was pressed gently against his lips. Okay, I get it. You understand, said Ryoko, looking a little annoyed but still smiling. You can give the motivational speech or whatever while you're running to the forest. Come on, time's a-wasting. Izuku nodded, taking off instantly as fast as he could while pacing himself. Though, as he did, he failed to notice the yellow eyes watching his feet as he was airborne for a few seconds longer than normal. The one thing that both women seemed to agree on was that Izuku would need time off for himself, time to rest both body and mind. While Izuku was thankful that they were looking after his well-being, his own thoughts on the matter were very different. The entrance exam to get into 𝐸 was not something years into the future, but rather nothing more than a few short months. As such, he needed to make every day count. So, on his first rest day, he had decided to exercise in his room for the first half and then head to the beach for some target practice. After all, this was supposed to be his day off, meaning he could spend it however he chose. Hey Izuku, I just got my hands on this new 𝐔𝐸𝐽, began Ryoko, her voice causing the green-haired teen to pause in mid-push-up as he turned his head to look at the alien, eyes wide with shock. The only thing he could see of her was her torso coming out from the door from her waist, floating several feet from the ground with a video game disc in one hand. Her eyes, at first, had been wide in surprise and her mouth was hanging open slightly. Then it snapped shut, her eyes narrowing slightly. What are you doing? The question was simple enough, but the tone in her voice, the lack of a smile, and the way she was looking at him all combined to send a shiver down Izuku's spine. Jay just thought I'd get a little extra work down, said Izuku with a loud gulp as he quickly changed position from a push-up to getting into a kneeling position. Why, trying to make up for lost time. Izuku, we just had a workout day yesterday, said Ryoko in an almost monotone voice that nearly made Izuku yelp in fear. He had heard her scream, bare her teeth, and show so many signs of her rage. But somehow now, as she walked into his room with her eyes glowing yellow and her voice displaying no emotion, were far more terrifying. Are you telling me you were half-assing that? What? Yelled Izuku. No, I'm giving it my all. Honest. Oh really? She asked, now a small bit of emotion in her voice. Anger, frustration. He could hear it clearly as red sparks appeared on her hand. At the same time, Ryo-Oki appeared on Ryoko's shoulder to look down upon him. It was weird seeing a cute bunny-like creature actually giving him a disapproving look. That's funny, because, the way I see it, if you really were giving it your all, you should be too weak to even be considering this. I'm sorry, screamed Izuku, sweat pouring down his face now while rivers of tears appeared in his eyes. I'm sorry. Ryoko then reached out her hand, the spark stopping as she grabbed Izuku by the shirt before pulling him up to her eye level. For a moment, she glared at him with those piercing eyes that just seemed to endlessly bear into his soul. Then, good, she said with a more cheerful tone, a smile returning to her face. I hope we won't need to have this conversation again, right? Izuku could only sputter out several clumsy attempts to agree while all the while nodding his head like a madman as both Ryoko and Ryo-Oki gave sage-like nods. 5 minutes later, Izuku found himself in the living room with a gaming console controller in his hands and Ryoko sitting next to him. For the rest of the day, Izuku stayed there playing games with Ryoko and Ryo-Oki, losing every single time. While it was embarrassing to lose to an animal that didn't even possess opposable thumbs, the young Midoriya found it hard not to enjoy himself as he laughed at the little victory dances Ryo-Oki made whenever she won. Or be awed by how into these games Ryoko got. It made him feel, for the first time in a long time, that he was just an average, everyday teenager living in Japan. And it was good. I'm so bored, whined Ryoko as she laid on the couch, legs crossed while one foot tapped the air endlessly. Both of her hands were behind her head as she looked up at the ceiling with almost pleading eyes for it to do something. Anything. In the 3 months since she had started living here on Earth with the Midoriya family, Ryoko had been having the time of her life. Sure, it wasn't the same thrill she had while laughing her head off as she taunted the authorities chasing her from planet to planet or making off with piles of loot that she had stolen. Not to mention the rush she felt in those high-stakes poker games where she bet all her loot at some of the seediest bars and back alleys. Those were great and all, but the fun she was having here felt more like something from a carnival. Simple joys that made memories that would last a lifetime. It was fun training her future partner in crime. It was fun just talking to someone who wasn't ogling her body as they stalled for one of their friends to call the cops on her or trying to slip her something in her drink. It was fun playing games with Izuku and having him show her around the earth. Not to mention the food here was top-notch, made all the better by the fact she wasn't having to worry that someone in the restaurant might realize who she really was. And just like at a carnival, there were low points, specifically the moments where you had to wait for your next game, which was what was happening right now. Ryoko let out another sigh, her foot tapping increasing as she shut her eyes in frustration. Yes, she was in one of those stupid lines waiting to either have some fun at a game booth or get her next tasty treat. Why? Because Izuku was in that damned prison this planet had the nerve to call an educational facility. And 𝐭 was at work, so it was just her and Ryooki with nothing to do until fun time began once more. Speaking of Ryooki, Ryoko opened her eye to look over at the windowsill where her partner, Spaceship, was. The small furry creature was there napping peacefully as the fall sun warmed her fur. "You're a lot of help," grumbled Ryoko as she looked back at the ceiling, trying to think of something to do. But what could she do that she already hadn't? Right now she wasn't up to playing any video games. She had already played all them solo plenty of times that the novelty and challenge had worn out, save when she played them with someone else. Then she could at least have someone to talk, tease to. Television was out as she had already flipped through the channels several times, seeing that all the shows that had caught her interest were on reruns. She supposed she could look at one of those cooking shows if only to have background noise or watch people making idiots of themselves for the amusement of others. The only real problem with that is if there was a recipe on screen that called for a boatload of carrots, Ryooki would be pestering her non-stop until she made it. As for reading, she had read the only things that had caught her attention multiple times already: Izuku's collection of vintage action manga as well as his notebooks. The manga, as well as a decent chunk of comics from the USA. She had discovered a few days after she had started living here, finding them all neatly tucked away in boxes stacked in a corner of his closet. They were pretty diverse, from martial arts action stories, heroes, and some dealing with the more supernatural elements. The only thing space-related was something called Guardians of the Galaxy, which amused her, especially the talking raccoon. But all of them seemed to come from the pre-Quirk era, as the people of this planet like to call it, a time before their genetics weren't a super-powered lottery. And a majority of the stories that Izuku had collected showed a person who was originally without powers either gaining them in some fashion or getting equipment to supplement the lack of before going on adventure after adventure. Unfortunately, Izuku's collection was extremely incomplete. There were massive holes in his collection, meaning there were large gaps in all of the various storylines, making it difficult to figure out what was going on at times. When she had brought this up to Izuku, he had seemed embarrassed before explaining the sad truth. Books like them were hard to find these days. It was the sad truth about living in a world full of super-powered beings that the fantastic was a common thing. Why pay someone to write and draw a comic about beings with superpowers when you can watch similar fights on the street? As such, the demand for stories like these wavered into a dull trickle, with the only ones being produced now featuring the current real-life heroes. Everything else was dumped into used bookstores, if not thrown away altogether. Even former legendary heroes from America like Batman and Superman and Spider-Man were not spared this fate. Their stories all but forgotten about. At least she didn't have the same problem when it came to Izuku's notebooks. Sure, the first couple were, less than ideal as they had been written when Izuku was still using something called crayons, but they got much better as time went on. She could see the evolution of his note-taking skill. They had become neater, far more organized as he began diving into what a pro hero could do with such fine details while assessing other possible skills they might also have, their weakness, movesets, and even how popular they might be in the future. His only real fault was that his art was still lacking. By this point, Ryoko had read all of them at least once, but the one notebook she had read the most was perhaps the oldest, that being the hero analysis of Izuku himself. The first half of the first page was covered in his 4-year-old handwriting, which simply read, "Hero quirk, none," rather than crossing it out. Izuku's more mature handwriting followed below that, as if to remember the feeling of that smaller version of himself. There he wrote as neatly as possible his quirk, followed by, of all things, an index detailing the pages where he would be discussing his varied abilities, with each part separated by an even number of blank pages. At the top of each page he had written a specific power, followed by a detailed description of what the powers could do, what he hoped he could do with them, how Ryoko used them, and finally what he could actually do with them now. Sadly, she had already gone over it after Izuku left, hoping that he had started showing signs of one of his other powers or had made any progress with the ones he already had. The simple answer was no. Nothing had been updated in the damned notebook since last week, when she had explained to him needing to get into the right mindset in order to use the powers. Shortly after that, Izuku had somewhat managed to unlock his ability to fly. And by somewhat, she meant that he could now float a good foot or so in the air. Since then, Ryoko had been focusing his quirk training on trying to get him to fly higher. While she could see that he was trying, it was as if there was a barrier above him keeping him from going any higher. Unable to figure out what was wrong, Ryoko swallowed her pride and steeled her courage to make a call to her home world in order to get some help. Most of the conversation, including who she had it with, would be taken to the grave with her. The only thing that she would tell Izuku was that this was more than likely a mental barrier of sorts, perhaps fear. Whatever the case, Ryoko didn't have the slightest clue how to help him with this. She was the sort that just blasted away any issues she had. Not to mention she had faith that Izuku would overcome whatever was holding him down. At least thinking about books had given her an idea on how to pass the time. "I'm heading to the library," said Ryoko as she teleported herself into a standing position. Briefly, she began to stretch out a bit, a smile appearing on her face. Yeah, the library was a great idea. She could go out, stretch her legs for a bit, see the sights, and maybe pick up a dozen or so manga. Sure, there wouldn't be anything there like in Izuku's collection, but she had other interests beyond fighting. Like finding a comedy with plenty of dirty humor, or maybe one where a princess-like character is in utter misery. "You coming, Ryo-Oki?" The Cabot raised an ear at that, her eyes still closed, making it difficult to tell if she was thinking or if it was just a reflex. "Well, for those people who weren't Ryoko, that is. If you come, we might pass by a bakery selling carrot cake." As soon as Ryoko's sing-song voice flowed through the room, Ryo-Oki leapt into the air with an excited meow. Stars were in the Cabot's eyes as she bounced around the room, crying out in joy with each leap until she landed on Ryoko's head. With Ryoko's furry partner on her head, the space pirate walked to the door and phased through it, leaving the barrier locked. Ryoko let out a hum as she walked down the streets, hands behind her head as she did so. The streets were, for the most part, deserted with only a few older people walking along the sides. A couple of them sparred a glance at Ryoko, frowning and shaking their heads in disapproval before looking away. Not that Ryoko cared in the slightest what they thought of her. "Hey, look over there," said Ryoko, her attention drawn to a shop just up the road. It was a small, one-story shop that she had visited when Izuku had offered to show her around the neighborhood when she first started living here. The name of it escaped her at the moment, but she recalled there were plenty of tasty treats inside. Things like potato chips, soda, and chocolate. "Think we should pick up some chips on our way back home for a reading snack?" "Meow, meow," went the Cabot as she leaned forward, poking her head off of Ryoko's to look down at the woman. Though Ryoko could only see Ryo-Oki's face upside down, she could see the slight worry that was on it as she let out a few more meows. "Don't worry, we'll be able to find our way back," said Ryoko, instantly translating what her partner said with an eye roll. "Come on, give me a little credit. Izuku showed me the way a couple of times already. And when have I ever gotten us lost before?" Ryo-Oki gave Ryoko a deadpan expression before letting out a single meow, causing Ryoko to snort. "That time doesn't count. I was drunk." As Ryoko continued to walk, she was met with another series of meows as the Cabot moved back up to the top of her head. "No, I'm not stealing the books. Izuku and 𝐭 got me a library card. All I have to do is show it to them and I can check out as many mangas as I want." As if to emphasize the point, Ryoko reached into her sleeve and pulled out a laminated card. On it was a picture of herself smiling smugly along with the name Ryoko Midoriya written under Musutafu Public Library. Looking up, she saw Ryo-Oki leaning forward to begin sniffing the card. When she was over, Ryo-Oki looked down at her partner with a look of shock and surprise before letting out a drawn-out meow. "Of course it's real," yelled Ryoko with a huff. At that, Ryo-Oki held up its paws as if she were shrugging while her head began to shake back and forth in a manner that screamed, "Can you blame me for thinking that?" A low growl escaped Ryoko's throat as she saw that, her eye twitching madly in irritation. "How deplorable. I know. The nerve of children these days." A more serious look fell upon Ryoko's features, glancing at the two older women she had over her. Across the street from her was a woman who had sheep-like features, white hair that looked more like wool as well as the face of the animal, bent down as she whispered to her friend with her hand covering her mouth. Said friend was even more bizarre in her appearance, with wrinkled skin whose color reminded Ryoko of a prune. And while her hand was held up as well, in a vain attempt to keep the conversation between the two of them, Ryoko could see thin trails of a purple liquid coming out of her mouth, probably from a quirk. Both of them were looking at Ryoko with obvious distaste, something the teen was used to. "Look at her, walking about like she doesn't have a care in the world," said the sheep woman. "Bet she's ditching school like the rest of the hoodlums in the area," added the prune woman, shaking her head in disgust as she did so. "I swear, heroes these days should be rounding these delinquents and marching them back to class." Ryoko never said a word, only continuing to walk while keeping the two elder women in the corner of her eye for as long as she could. While a part of her wanted to fly over there and scream at the two, it didn't seem worth it. They were just two old fools who liked to talk trash about people behind their backs, using their age as a shield to get away from such things like retaliation. Besides, on the insult level, What they said barely made it to level 1. That, plus she didn't want to cause trouble for the Midoriyas. After walking for several more minutes and making a couple of turns, Ryoko came across what she could only assume to be a few of the delinquents up the road. There were 4 of them, sitting in various positions in a circle with several cans of soda tossed around them. 2 of them were wearing casual clothing that hung loosely off their frames. One of these 2 was wearing an oversized white hoodie along with ripped jeans. The hood was up to cover most of his face, but thanks to where he was situated, Ryoko could see that his eyes looked like lenses belonging to an old-style camera. The other casually dressed teen had on an old orange sweatshirt with the sleeves cut off, exposing his arms, which, starting at the elbow, began to turn red and ending in pinchers like that of a lobster. The other 2 were wearing black school uniforms that looked a lot like the one Izuku wore, but unlike the neat and tidy way Izuku kept his, these guys kept their jackets open to reveal the picture of a man with a flaming beard. One of these 2 looked normal with slicked back black hair, while the last one had a head covered by red metal spikes growing out of his scalp. Ryoko also noticed all of them had a dozen piercings each, rings and studs located on their lips, noses, and ears. As she drew closer to them, a small smile appeared on her face. It was adorable to see weaklings pretending to be tough. "Hey, hey," said the spiky-haired guy when he noticed Ryoko. The space pirate's grin grew savagely as he got up, placing an unlit matchstick in his mouth as he approached her. "Looks like you're on the lookout for a good time." "Yep," said Ryoko happily, "which is why I'm only passing through." The other 3 teens let out a collective "ooh" before snickering. But Spiky Hair did not back down. "Come on, don't be like that, baby," he said with a smile that made Ryoko's smile drop slightly. "I know all the best places around here where we can spend some alone time together. Ask any lady around here and they'll tell you all about how time with me is like a dream." The teen ended that statement with a wink. "Why, because you bored them to sleep," jeered Ryoko, her eyes narrowing slightly, hoping that this fool would take the hint. He did not. Now, let's not," said Spiky as his hand began to reach out to touch Ryoko's shoulder. But he got no further as Ryoko's fist collided with his face. His friends watched in horror as Spiky was knocked down to the pavement, blood seeping from his nose while his face had an imprint of Ryoko's fist. Spiky let out a howl of pain and rage before looking up at Ryoko. Said woman merely looked down at him, the humor in her face gone as her eyes in a murderous fashion. Her finger then began to move, creating loud cracking noises as each joint twitched. You, bitch," screamed Spiky as he quickly got on all 4s before turning around to see that his friends had already started running. He then looked back at her with watery eyes. "I'll make you pay for this. Just wait till 𝐒𝐿 hears about this. Then you'll be sorry." With that, he began to take off towards the fleeting images of his friends. Ryoko merely laughed as she placed her hands behind her head. "Oh yeah, right. Just wait. I'm gonna tell on you, then you'll be sorry. Really threatening if you're a 5-year-old princess." Shaking her head, Ryoko continued her walk while Ryo-Oki let out her own mews of laughter. "Honestly, those old hags wanted heroes to deal with these idiots." The 4 punks made their way down the streets of Musutafu as fast as their legs would allow, passing by adults who gave them nothing more than disapproving looks. But they didn't care about them or the sweat that began to pour down their faces caused by the unintentional exercise as well as fear. From time to time, one of the 4 would look behind them as if expecting the woman to be right behind them like a slasher in a movie, though she was never there. That didn't stop them from running with all their might as they made several turns down the streets. Eventually, they came across an area that was littered with graffiti. Images of wild and exotic animals had been spray painted onto the walls and streets. Animals like tigers, gorillas, hammerhead sharks, rhinos, and so on. All of them were well done with such care and detail that they almost looked like they could begin moving at any moment. The group passed them all, only slowing down when they spotted a teen a few years older than they were. The teen was tall with unusually slender limbs that made people think that he had a scarecrow quirk. Splotches of paint stained his jeans while a specialized belt with holsters that looked eerily like they were meant to hold guns circled it, thankfully holding spray paint cans instead of firearms. The teen's upper body was covered in a bright red, faux leather jacket with large zippers where the pockets were and looking surprisingly clean. As for his other features, the teen boy's hair had been stylized into a series of multicolored spikes. Sunglasses were situated at the bridge of his long, almost pointy nose to obscure his eyes. Currently, the teen known as 𝗏𝗏 was in the middle of working on his latest creation, a massive, angry-looking gorilla whose meaty fists were pounding on its chest as its fangs were bared. Boss, said the spiky-haired teen known to his friends as Tetsumaki. "We have a problem." 𝗏𝗏, however, acted like he didn't hear a thing as he instead continued with his work as Tetsumaki continued to talk in a panic. There was this girl. She punched me in the face. "I can see that," said 𝗏𝗏 finally, not looking away from his work as he switched cans, tossing the can he had been holding into an empty holster without needing to look down before pulling out a different can. He shook it a little before a stream of green shot out as he began to work on the grass. Well, began 𝗧𝗵𝗲, a slight sweat drop appearing on the side of his head. Shouldn't we do something about this? See, can't having some girl going around disrespecting the gang. Why, you'll help, right? 𝗵𝗃 stopped his work, letting out a sigh as the gorilla he had been working on came to life. It leapt from its 2D surface, becoming the real thing as it lifted 𝗧𝗵𝗲 into the air with a savage roar. The teen in the animal's clutches screamed in surprise and fear as he was then shaken back and forth. Let me guess, you were hitting on another girl and couldn't take the hint she wasn't into you, said 𝗵𝗃, his tone icy cold as he turned to look up at 𝗧𝗵𝗲. The gorilla's grip then tightened before suddenly slamming 𝗧𝗵𝗲 face first into the pavement, as if done so by a silent order. As the other 3 teens cried out in shock, 𝗧𝗵𝗲 was slowly lifted back up while blood fell to the ground from the numerous cuts on his heavily bruised and battered face. Please, wheezed 𝗧𝗵𝗲, his voice coming out pitifully as he began to hack blood and teeth. When he had finished, the gorilla held him upright so that he was at eye level with the one who held his life with his quirk. You stupid, dumb trash, continued 𝗵𝗃 coldly, the gorilla adding pressure to 𝗧𝗵𝗲's ribs as he spoke. I've told you before not to cause trouble for the gang. What if this girl goes to the cops? Or worse, an actual pro? With a growl, 𝗵𝗃 punched 𝗧𝗵𝗲 in the gut, making the teen whimper in pain. Because of you, the gang has to get involved. 𝗵𝗃 then looked over at the teen with lens for eyes. Please tell me that you got a good look at her. Or else you'll. I did, shouted the lens quirk user, interrupting his boss. A moment later, his eyes began to glow before light shot out of them and hit the ground near the bloody pool. This teen's quirk, memory lens, was a useful one for the gang. He could store whatever he saw in his mind with perfect detail for up to 48 hours and then project those images. So no one was surprised when a life-sized version of the girl 𝗧𝗵𝗲 had hit on appeared before them. 𝗵𝗃 said nothing at first, merely circling the girl with a rabbit on her head for some reason as he gave her a once-over. Then, after a moment or two, he nodded. All right then, get the whole gang ready to find her. I want her found as soon as possible before she goes to the cops. Or worse, a hero. Damn it. He then looked over at his bloody underling. And while you're all doing that, I need to teach someone a lesson. 𝗧𝗵𝗲, laughed Ryoko as she walked back to the Midoriya residence with the air of a hero returning with a dragon's hoard. Her trip to the library had proven to be a complete success as it held a stockpile of manga. Aisle after aisle of brightly covered books Ryoko had sought were on full display and showing that they held the complete series of each title. Now in one hand, Ryoko held onto the straps of the paper bag large enough to hold groceries with her treasures stacked neatly on top of each other. In her other hand was a smaller, plastic bag filled with junk food for her to munch on while she read. Meow, came a noise from on top of Ryoko's head. While the space pirate was all smiles, the same could not be said of her furry partner. Ryoki sat there, her front paws crossed while she pouted. Hey, I told you I would get you a carrot cake if they had any, said Ryoko, her voice holding a little annoyance from having to repeat herself for what felt like the 10th time since they started the trek home. Still, it wasn't enough for her smile to fade. And they were all out because someone is causing a supply shortage. You're just going to have to deal with it. Before the cabot could continue to pout, something landed in front of the pair, causing Ryoko to stop. Looking down was the bloody, mangled body of somebody that looked somewhat familiar to Ryoko. She might have been able to recognize him if it wasn't for the fact that his face looked like it had had a long and deeply personal conversation with the cement. His clothing laid across his body in shreds, claw marks clearly visible across his body, as well as a number of tiny holes in his skin that resembled bite marks. Well, that's something you don't see every day, said Ryoko as she blinked as she looked more curious than anything else before reaching out with her foot to poke the form. The thing that she was now poking let out a moan of pain and Ryoko pulled her foot back. Then, Ryoko looked up to see that the street had changed since last she had been down it. Graffiti animals were everywhere now, things like snakes, giant squids, gorillas, and other animals she had seen in those nature documentaries. Then, as if on cue, humans began to walk out into the street. Some hopped over fences and walls while others strode out of alleyways, all of them gathering in the middle of the street to create a massive horde. None of these humans looked like they had gotten the chance to have their 20th birthday as they looked at Ryoko with smug satisfaction. And, at the front, was a teen wearing a red jacket walking towards her like he owned everything around him. And Ryoko just sighed in slight annoyance, but only slightly as a savage smile appeared on her face, eyes narrowing a bit as she stepped over the bloody body. So what do we have here? Asked Ryoko before noticing a few people in the crowd. At least 2 of them she recognized as the idiots who were with that moron who had tried to flirt with her. Let me guess, the bozo actually went crying to his boss because he couldn't handle the love tap I gave him. Yes, he did, said the teen in the leather jacket, stopping in his tracks to pull down his sunglasses just enough for Ryoko to make out his orange eyes. As his eyes fell upon her, Ryoko could feel him sizing her up. I had to take the liberty of punishing him further for bothering you. I hope you don't mind. Not really, said Ryoko as she gave a glance behind her towards the prone body. To be honest, I hadn't really given him a second thought after our little run-in. But I get the feeling you didn't do this just to make me feel better. Let me guess, you told him not to cause trouble. The teen, 𝗵𝗃, let out a laugh that was void of humor. Smart. I like it. The laughter died just as quickly as it started, a sigh escaping the gang leader's lips before continuing. Yeah, normally heroes in these parts overlook us since we're not newsworthy enough or won't fetch them the big bucks. Well, as long as we don't go too overboard, that is. But with the likes of 𝗏𝗏 in the area, that's the sort of guy who probably has so much fame and cash that he might start dragging us to jail just for the kicks. That or some sense of helping and yada, yada, yada. So I tell my crew here not to cause too much trouble until the big man leaves. Another sigh escaped 𝗵𝗃's lips. Now don't get me wrong here. If you were some punk-ass bitch trying to lay claim on my turf, then I wouldn't mind getting a little involved. But bothering some girl to the point where she hits him, then having the balls to come running to me asking for help, well now, that just won't do. As he said this last part, 𝗵𝗃 wagged a finger in the air before glancing back at the gang who stood there in nervous silence. Ryoko let out a hum of understanding as she closed her eyes, a smile still on her face. So you beat him within an inch of his life just to send a message to the rest of the peons, she said as she slowly opened her eyes, even going as far as making a big production of it. I get it. I would do the same thing if I were in your shoes. And here comes the part where you tell me that it's not personal, but you can't let the image of your gang go unchallenged. I'm right, aren't I? Oh, please tell me I'm right. 𝗵𝗃 let out a laugh as he brought his hands together. Thank you, he said through his chuckles. You don't know how much of a bore it is to explain my reasoning every single time. Sure, it was fun the first dozen or so times, but saying the same things over and over again just became too repetitive. 𝗵𝗃 then smiled as he took a step forward, gesturing behind him as he spoke. Please don't worry about them. My crew is only here to make sure you don't try running away. But, seeing as how you didn't go to the heroes, I'm willing to make you a little offer. I'll let you take the place of that worm behind you if you take a knee and submit to my 𝗵𝗃 was cut off by a loud crack as Ryoko tilted her head to the side. She then tilted it in the opposite direction, another loud crack echoing through the streets which caused several of the gang members to shudder. Ryoko, do you mind taking care of the small fries? Asked Ryoko as she gently set down her bags. The cabot let out a mew as she upturned her tiny nose before turning around and hopping off Ryoko's head. Wow, you really know how to hold a grudge. Fine, whatever. More fun for me. What? Was all 𝗵𝗃 could say, his glasses nearly falling off his nose. I like that jacket, said Ryoko, seeming to ignore the question as she placed a hand on her chin. I think I'll just take it when I'm done with you. 𝗵𝗃 just stared at her for a moment or two before pushing up his sunglasses. Don't get too carried away. Because you defeated one underling. There's a reason I'm the undisputed boss of this gang. My quirk is so powerful that I made it into UA. As he screamed the name of school, the graffiti gorilla came to life, standing behind 𝗵𝗃 as it pounded its chest. That's right, I took the exam to get into the hero course of the greatest hero school in the world ... and passed. I'd be in my third year right now had I not gotten expelled halfway through the first year. 𝗵𝗃 now looked livid, but Ryoko didn't care as she placed both hands behind her head. Oh wow, laughed Ryoko in a way that showed all her teeth. So you went from trying to make it into the big leagues to settling for the biggest fish in the shittiest pond. No wonder they kicked you out. You, breathed 𝗵𝗃 as he began to rein in his temper. After taking a few deep breaths, he managed to compose himself. I think I understand. You think that my quirk allows me to simply create illusions of the things I paint. Sorry, but my quirk, bloody art, is nothing that weak. These creatures are 100% real. Here, why don't I show you? On command, the gorilla lunged forward as it began to run towards Ryoko on all fours. The space girl saw this, quickly lowering her arms as she got into a battle stance. When the painted beast was no more than a few yards away, it leapt into the air as it flung itself at its target. But before it could get any closer, Ryoko teleported in front of it with her fist pulled back. The fake gorilla barely had time to look down as the space pirate slammed her fist into its gut. Rather than being flung backwards, the creature exploded into paint, shooting away from Ryoko, where it then splattered onto the ground. How? Gasped 𝗵𝗃, his sunglasses falling off his face as Ryoko stood there, staring at her clenched fist in confusion. Really? She said as she looked up. That's all it took to take one down. Wow, this zoo is shittier than I thought. That punch was barely stronger than the one I used to knock out what's his name. With that, Ryoko began to slowly walk towards 𝗵𝗃. No, no, yelled the gang leader, his face morphing into an expression of horror as he summoned more of his art from the walls. The tentacles of the giant squid began to wiggle through the air as they approached Ryoko ... only for her to backhand it without even looking. The tendrils of the underwater beast met with the same end as his gorilla, ink splattering against the paved street and fences while the creature let out a cry of pain. The giant squid then fell to the ground, its body appearing to melt onto the street as Ryoko walked past it with nary a glance towards it. Her slow walk, the savage smile on her lips, and ease of which she had defeated the painted monsters sent a clear wave of fear through the gang. They cried out in terror as if they were watching a monster crawling out of the pits of hell itself before running without looking back. But 𝗏𝗏, he couldn't move. Whether it was bravery, a delusional belief that he could still win, or fear, Ryoko had no idea. Nor did she really care as 𝗏𝗏 let out a cry that echoed through the streets. Large, massive snakes began to slither out the paved fences and streets, rushing towards Ryoko while an even larger brown bear appeared. All of the snakes opened their mouths, revealing their large, massive fangs which dripped with paint instead of venom. But as they drew closer, Ryoko pointed a sparking finger at the one furthest to her side before making a sweeping motion. In the blink of an eye, a series of thin red beams were fired, striking each snake right at the forehead, which exploded in rapid succession. Each of the snakes' heads exploded, paint splattering everywhere as the rest of their bodies fell limp to the floor before they too became nothing more than pools of paint. As for the bear, he rushed towards her at a speed that surpassed the gorilla, lifting a meaty claw to swipe down upon her. At first, 𝗏𝗏 thought that this would do it, that this attack would at least land a hint on the woman, until her hand took hold of the bear's paw and squeezed it so tightly that the claw exploded, followed swiftly by the rest of the beast. As the remains of the bear fell to the ground, so too did 𝗏𝗏 as his legs finally gave out on him. Ryoko smirked inwardly as she continued her slow walk. The only sounds she could hear now were the chattering of his teeth as well as the sounds of her footsteps. While there was more graffiti he could still use in some last-ditch effort, his posture was one she had witnessed far too many times. He had given up. "Please, don't hurt me," stammered 𝗏𝗏 as Ryoko got closer. As her voice remained silent, the poor teen punk quickly got onto his knees, where he then began to quickly take off his jacket. He seemed to wrestle with it a bit, his arm getting stuck in the sleeve, briefly causing a moment of panic. But eventually he removed it and tossed it at Ryoko's feet, causing her to stop. "Why, you said you all liked it. It's yours. Just take it. Take it and let me go." Said Ryoko finally, placing a hand on her chin as she looked at 𝗏𝗏 a bit more carefully. The black shirt he was wearing underneath the jacket looked to be about her size, as did his jeans, maybe even his shoes. Devilishly she grinned at the teen who began to shrink in her presence. Then she uttered a single word. "Strip. 10 to 1 home," said Izuku as he opened the door to the apartment, one hand holding onto the doorknob while the other held onto his phone. His eyes darted back and forth as he read the latest hero news, deeply engaged in this rather unusual breaking news. So much so that he almost dismissed the laughter coming from the living room. After taking off his shoes, Izuku looked up from his phone and blinked hard when he saw Ryoko. The space woman was laying on her back on the couch, snickering into the pages of the massive, multi-volume manga she was reading with one hand. The opposite was positioned near a bowl of chips which, just by glancing at the bowl, he could see that she had gotten through more than half so far. But that wasn't what had caused him to blink. Far from it. "Did you do some shopping today?" he asked as Ryoko took one of the chips from the bowl. She turned to look at him, half a chip sticking out of her mouth as she did so. She blinked at him in confusion, causing Izuku to point down at what she was wearing. The space pirate looked down at her black top, which showed off her figure just a bit, as well as the bright red faux leather jacket she was wearing. Izuku also noticed the obviously used jeans she was wearing, as they had paint splotches running up and down the legs. "Oh, this," she said after finishing the chip. "Decided to change things up a bit. Got them practically for free off the streets." She then slipped back into a lying position. "So, anything happened in prison today?" Izuku fought hard to not roll his eyes as he moved closer to her. "It's called school." "Same thing," she said, flipping the page, followed by a snort of laughter. "No, nothing happened," he said with a sigh, deciding not to tell her that he had another run-in with the explosion Quirk user. "But there is this new article in the hero news that has the heroes around here scratching their heads. A guy got mugged and left naked on the streets." Ryoko seemed to perk at that, slowly turning her head. "Oh," was all she said, a slight smile on her face while a few beads of sweat appeared on her brow. "Yeah," said Izuku slowly as he took the sight in. "The guy said it was a monster ... but after looking at the sketch he gave." Izuku held the phone up for Ryoko to see. Her eyes widened and she quickly dropped the book she had been reading to take hold of the device with both hands. Her face turned red while her teeth bared at what she saw. Filling the screen was an image which, at first, Izuku had assumed to be a mutation Quirk user's form. Its hair was spiky and slicked back, the same color as silver. Its face looked demonic, with sharp pointed teeth like that of a cobra and bright blue fur covering the body. The figure's fingers had been replaced with claws dripping with blood. Yeah, Izuku had, at first, thought it was a Quirk user. But now that he thought about it, "You robbed him, didn't you?" he asked in a deadpan tone. "Only after he assaulted me," screamed Ryoko as she looked back up at him, tears forming in her eyes. "I can't believe you would think that a person who has been living under the same roof as you for months now, would attack someone without a reason. Izuku Midoriya, you hurt me. You attacked me when we first met," he answered with the same deadpan tone and matching expression. Hey, she said as the tears instantly vanished. Waving a finger in the air in front of her while a more serious expression appeared on her face. "To be fair, we had just been attacked by a pile of who knows what and you ran away from me after I gave you the wonderful offer to join my crew. It was a pretty tense situation." Izuku only blinked at her, not saying anything. For her part, Ryoko just sighed before sliding back down into her lying position. "Well, at any rate, you should start getting ready for tonight's training. We got a busy night ahead of us." "But Ryoko, what about?" began Izuku, only to be halted when Ryoko held up a finger, not bothering to turn her head away from her book. "No need for worries right now," was all she said. Come on," said Ryoko in an eager tone as she pushed on Izuku's back down an old stone path that looked like it had seen better days. Snow had been pushed to the sides, its pure whiteness making the gray and browns of the path stick out all the more. The trees around them were bare, save the icicles hanging from the branches, which gave the scenery a charm one might think only existed on a greeting card. Ryoko's giddiness was infectious, making Izuku smile all the more as he quickened his pace as best he could while being mindful of possible eyes glancing at her briefly. He let out another laugh as Ryo-Oki, from her favorite perch on top of Ryoko's head, was trying to catch some of the snowflakes with her tiny paws. It had now been 6 months since that fateful day since he had met the space pirate laughing behind him. 6 months of working his body, mind, and his new quirk to be ready for the entrance exam at UA, but that also meant 6 months of Ryoko taking the reins of his off days. Ryoko's enthusiasm for this seemed unending, as she always seemed to have something in mind for when it was time for Izuku to relax like a normal teen. And some of the stuff they did was within the realm of normal. Together they would go to an arcade where Izuku would watch Ryoko struggle with the crane games or take the new top spot in the shooting games. Take him to a fireworks festival, going out to dinner, or even just seeing a movie together. But there were also the things they did that, well, Izuku didn't think many kids his age could do as frequently. Like heading over to New York to see the sights, heading to an expensive theme park, and even going to a beach on a tropical island in the middle of nowhere. He supposed having access to a spaceship helped cut the cost of travel. But, no matter where they went, Ryoko seemed to embrace everything with the wide-eyed excitement of a child. He couldn't count all the times she had taken him by the wrist just to drag him to something that had caught her eye, be it something shiny, expensive, or just fun. Being an only child, Izuku had to wonder if this was what it was like to have a sister. A sudden push snapped Izuku back into the moment as he was pushed into the lobby of the small, wooden resort they had traveled to. The room itself looked rustic, with a small fire pit in its center that was currently ablaze. Traditional Japanese art hung from the walls that looked like they would have been old back in the time of Izuku's grandparents. And across from the door was a wooden front desk. Looking at it made Izuku blink in surprise, finding that it lacked a visible computer. The only thing on it was a thick, open sign and book. "Oh, it seems we have guests," came a woman's voice, its suddenness nearly making Izuku jump. A moment later the speaker entered the lobby from a side door, dressed in an Arctic blue kimono and her white hair tied up in a bun. As she turned to greet them, Izuku wondered if her hair had something to do with her quirk, as she didn't seem that old. Maybe her early 50s to late 40s. "That's right," said Ryoko with a grin. "Got any rooms available for the night?" At first, it looked like the woman was about to answer with a yes, only to halt as Ryo-Oki let out a loud mew. Blinking, the woman tilted her head slightly to gaze up at the cabbit, who was now licking one of her front paws. For a moment, nothing was said as a frown appeared on the face of the person in front of the pair. Then, finally, she looked down with a frown. "I'm sorry, but this establishment does not allow pets," she said in a flat tone. "A pet?" yelled Ryoko, her tone sounding scandalized, while Izuku fought back a laugh as he knew where this was going. He watched as Ryoko took Ryo-Oki off her head before holding the cabbit in front of her. Said cabbit's eyes were looking at the woman behind the welcoming deck in the most heartbreaking fashion, with tears running down her fuzzy face. How could you say that about my daughter? She can't help it if her quirk did this to her." The woman's eyes widened in horror at this statement, not helped by the fact that Ryo-Oki was nodding her head as if to say it's true. Unable to look at Ryo-Oki any longer, the woman turned around to face the wall behind her while her hands reached up, holding her cheeks. For a while, she stood there and Izuku could hear her mumbling something under her breath. Curious, the boy leaned forward a little and strained his ears only to make out a few bits and pieces. Things like I guess it is possible. Quirks these days can do. Is she really a mother? And that boy, so young. The lightest of blushes graced Izuku's cheeks, more due to the implication than anything else, as he leaned back just as the woman turned her head slightly to look at Ryo-Oki once more. She stared at the wide-eyed expression the 𝐻𝐵𝐵 had before turning around and letting out a whisper of so cute. Before turning around fully. Well, began the woman, coughing into her fist. Though, as she did this, Izuku noticed several snowflakes escaping her mouth as she did, making him wonder if she had an ice or snow-based quick, or just one that lowered the temperature of her mouth when she became embarrassed. Then, when the coughing ended, she spoke again. Well, that seems. What I mean to say is that there's no real proof that she isn't. I suppose that since there is no one else staying here, we shouldn't be turning away customers over such small things. The woman then shifted a little before turning the sign and book towards them. So, if you don't mind me asking, how long have you been? Forgive me for being a little curious, but you both seem rather young to be a couple and, well, unable to control themselves. Izuku and Ryoko let out a snort of laughter that disarmed the woman. Then, at once, their hands went to the other's shoulder before speaking at the same time. Actually, we're siblings. After several minutes of listening to the woman profusely apologizing over and over again, as well as stopping Ryoko from trying to extort a free meal and room from the woman, Izuku closed the door to the small room. Said room felt a bit more barren than most small-scale motel rooms, with only 2 beds and dresser. And while the room wasn't much to look at, the view he got from the long rectangular window was spellbinding as it showed the winter wonderland just beyond the walls. As Izuku walked over to the window to gaze out at the forest, he heard the bouncing of springs behind him. Well, the reviews weren't kidding when they called this place rustic and a great place to get away from the rest of the world. Izuku felt himself snort a little at that. No kidding. If we didn't have Ryo-Oki to give us a lift, then we would have had to take a 3-hour trip on the bus and get off in the middle on nowhere. It's a wonder this place is still running. The teen paused for a moment, stretching his arms as he continued to stare out the window before speaking again. Hopefully the reviews about the hot springs are just as accurate. They're outdoors, right? Yep, said the space pirate, her reflection in the window showing her toothy smile at him. The way they should be. No roof over your head to block out the sky. No slides like at some cheap water park. Izuku blinked at that, turning his head to look at Ryoko in bewilderment. Really? There are places like that? Ryoko nodded. Yeah, went to the famous planet of hot springs once. Place felt like one giant water theme park, tourist trap. Everything under these domes that kept the place temperature controlled and weatherproof. Honestly, it sounds like that would have been more up your alley than a traditional hot springs, said Izuku with a frown. For a moment, Ryoko's smile faded. I felt trapped. No way to tell if it was night or day, let alone knowing if the stars were out. Plus, when every hot spring is like that, it just loses something, no. Izuku thought about it for a moment before he found himself nodding. Yeah, if every hot spring was just like the other, then something would have been lost. It would have been like if every hero out there were the same. Same costume, same quirks. They would all just blend together and heroes like All Might wouldn't seem as special. Not to mention they wouldn't let me drink anything with all the kiddies running around, added Ryoko, Izuku's expression instantly deadpanning as he muttered there it is under his breath. Luckily, I managed to find this one off the beaten trail that was completely outdoors. Hey, maybe I'll take you there when you're ready to head into space. They had mixed bathing. That last part was said in a sing-song-like tone that caused Izuku's face to turn beet red, forcing him to look away. Please don't, begged Izuku as he placed his hands over his face to cover the blush. Ryoko, however, only laughed harder. You're too easy, she said, floating up into the air with her bag in tow. Welp, I'm going to get ready. As she began floating towards the adjacent bathroom, Izuku held up a hand. Wait, he said. There was a brief pause, Izuku waiting for Ryoko to turn around before beginning to talk again. I was wondering. I know today is a day off, but do you think we could do some light training? Just a little to stretch our muscles. Ryoko floated there, staring at Izuku for what seemed to go on forever. The teen boy stood there as straight as possible as he met her yellow gaze, preparing himself if she said no. Of course, he knew her well enough by this point that she wouldn't just say no anymore like she had that first time. Most likely, she would use a finger beam on him before reminding him, like she always did, that these days off were meant to give his body a break, to give him time to heal and be refreshed before he returned to the hell that was his training, school. Better she would teleport in front of him, give him an uppercut, and then give the speech about resting, or a roundhouse kick to the head. Or, yeah, sure, she said, dropping the bag onto the ground. Izuku blinked. Really? He asked as Ryoko began to stretch her arms while landing on the ground. You made a good point, she said with a nod. A light warm-up before heading into the hot springs will make them feel all the better. Plus I want to see how well you'll do out here. Izuku nodded, quickly reaching for his bag and pulling out his tracksuit before heading into the bathroom. Once inside, the teen swiftly shed off his green winter jacket, which was then placed on the door hanger, His shirt was the next to come off in favor of something that would be warmer, and, in doing so, the green-haired teen caught a glimpse of himself in the mirror for half a second. His training under 𝗧𝗃 had changed him from that skinny, weak kid he had once been, a fact that the boys in gym class couldn't help but notice and compliment him on, much to a certain ashen blonde's irritation. Now 𝗧𝗑 had a rather impressive six-pack, with well-defined, but not overly bulky, muscles on his arms and legs. It was like he now had the body of a well-trained, well-rounded martial artist who was strong yet light on his feet. Quickly, 𝗧𝗑 left the bathroom to find that 𝗧𝗃 was sitting on the bed waiting for him. Having not changed, she was sporting the jeans she had acquired that once had paint splattered all over them. Now, however, they were perfectly clean, and the red jacket that had become one of her favorite things to wear when it became chilly was zipped up. Several minutes later found the two somewhat deep in the forest within a snow-covered clearing, both master and student facing each other while standing several yards apart. 𝗧𝗑 stood there in a ready stance as he waited for 𝗧𝗃 to begin. He knew she would give him no signal, no warning that the training would begin. The reasoning was rather simple. Nobody will ever say, "Hey, you ready to throw down?" in a fight between heroes and villains. Thankfully, 𝗧𝗑 didn't have to wait long for 𝗧𝗃 to start. She flew towards the green-haired teen, her left fist pulled back and ready to strike. The attack, no, her entire style of fighting was something far different than anything 𝗧𝗑 had ever seen. It lacked the disciple that all of the pro martial art heroes used, nor was the simplistic brawler style used by heroes who heavily relied on their quirks. It was something that fit somewhere in the middle, born from constant battles on countless worlds. At least, that's what she told him still. 𝗧𝗑 had taken her instructions to heart as he jumped backwards without looking behind him so that the fist hit only air. But he didn't stop there as he began to jump backwards, jumping over bushes and dodging trees, all without ever looking behind him. There was a grin on the space pirate's face as she saw this before flying towards him again. Only now she was flying faster. Swiftly she closed the distance, passing through a tree 𝗧𝗑's shoulder had brushed against, before another strike from her fist came his way. Only 𝗧𝗑 was ready for it, letting the blow slide across his upturned arm for a moment before pushing it off to the side so that it missed him completely. At the same time, his other arm was pulled back with its hand clenched into a fist ready to make a powerful strike of its own. With a surge of speed, young Midoriya let his punch fly right towards 𝗧𝗃's side, and it would have connected had 𝗧𝗃 not pulled back right at the last second, so it struck only air. Seeing that his attack failed, 𝗧𝗑 continued to jump backwards while his eyes focused on 𝗧𝗃. 𝗧𝗑 had no idea how long the two of them went on like this as he bounced from side to side as he dodged the blows from 𝗧𝗃 as well as doing his best to avoid the surrounding plant life. This was just an aspect of the fighting style that 𝗧𝗃 had taught him, perhaps its most basic part. Never take your eyes off your opponent. Keep moving. Never stay in the same spot for too long. But never, ever show your back to your opponent unless there is no other choice. As such, 𝗧𝗃 had trained 𝗧𝗑 over the course of months on how to move backwards while rarely ever needing to look behind him. This sort of awareness was difficult to learn, the early parts of his training usually ending with him tripping over roots, bushes, or landing in some pretty foul-smelling things. And yet, despite the difficulties, 𝗧𝗑 began picking it up at a surprising speed. Sure, he wasn't perfect at it as he still bumped into things like trees from time to time or missed his footing, but he had also learned how to roll with it without losing too much momentum. And, as 𝗧𝗑 moved, the final pieces of a plan were falling into place, one that, he hoped, would let him land his first blow on 𝗧𝗃. Green energy danced around his finger like bolts of lightning, pointing it at a smirking 𝗧𝗃 as he jumped backwards. With steady breaths, he felt the power building up rapidly in his finger as he landed ... and then slipped on the snow. Or, at least, made it look like he had slipped. As his back headed for the cold snow beneath his feet, 𝗧𝗑 fired a beam of green energy up into the tree which he hoped would appear as a misfire. His attack struck one of the branches, causing snow to fall down, creating a semi-transparent barrier between them of white flakes. This was more than enough as 𝗧𝗑 charged another finger blast as he quickly leaned forward and used his limited flight to keep himself from falling on his back. Grinning, he then fired another beam of energy right in front of 𝗧𝗃, sending more snow and dirt into the air. Just barely he could tell that 𝗧𝗃 was backing off slightly, meaning it was time to put the final piece of his plan into action. He spun around the snowy barrier, ready to send a kick right into 𝗧𝗃's side, only to have 𝗧𝗃 grab his ankle, halting the attack. The green-haired teen felt a bit of panic right before 𝗧𝗃 pulled on his leg, sending him flying off to the side where he then landed back first into some bushes. 𝗧𝗑 tried to get up quickly, only to stop when 𝗧𝗃's palm appeared in his face. A bright red orb of energy appeared in it, nearly touching his nose. It was over, he had lost. 𝗧𝗑, that move, began 𝗧𝗃 as the orb vanished. Wasn't half bad. A small smile appeared on 𝗧𝗑's face as he heard that, holding out his hand to be quickly taken by the alien woman. Within moments they were both standing, brushing off the snow and dirt from their bodies. "I honestly thought you were just going to fire a beam at me after the first attack. Didn't expect the double distraction." "Yeah, well, it wasn't all that great," said Izuku, cheeks warm from the praise and the biting cold all around them. "I mean, I still couldn't land a hit on you. Only because I heard you coming," said Ryoko as she wagged a finger in front of Izuku's face. "Remember, as soon as you lose sight of your opponent, you need to make use of your other senses. I could hear the sound of the snow against your shoes, so I knew which way you were coming. Maybe if you had been just a tiny bit faster, you might have gotten me." The space woman then shivered slightly. "Well, that's all for tonight. Hot springs, here we come. Izuku let out a sigh as he sank into the water, the heat of the hot springs winning the war against the chill of the surrounding winter air. He laid there against the rock with his head resting against the divider that separated the men's and women's sides, watching as the vapors rose upwards to the inky black sky above. With each passing moment, he could feel the water work its magic on his body, causing the tension and pain to vanish as he looked up at the sky. Above him were more stars than he ever thought a person like him could see without the aid of a telescope, shining brightly as they formed a river of stars into the unknown. Relaxing more, Izuku found himself staring up at the world's roof as a thought came to him. "Yeah, I can see why Ryoko prefers these traditional hot springs. Great, isn't it?" came Ryoko, sounding almost like she was right beside him. Panic swept over Izuku, frantically looking around the hot spring to see if the space pirate had actually decided on impromptu mixed bathing. When Izuku didn't see her there, he began to look along the divider to see if her head was poking out while using her phasing ability. And when that turned up empty, he looked up expecting her to be looking down at him with a cat-like grin on her face. Thankfully, she was not there. As he calmed down, Izuku could hear Ryoko laughing, making him realize that she was still in the women's bath, most likely with her back to the divider like him. "Don't scare me like that," breathed Izuku. "I thought for sure you were, well." "The offer was made," said Ryoko, followed by a sipping sound. Izuku found that he could easily imagine Ryoko right now, his mind censoring her naked body by wrapping a towel around her as she sat there in the water while drinking sake. "Seems that the woman at the desk doesn't really buy the whole sibling thing. Offered to let us bathe together since we're the only ones here." Oh, said Izuku, his cheeks blushing slightly, though more from the implication than anything else. Then a thought came to mind, one that he couldn't dismiss. So, as Izuku looked down at his reflection, he spoke. Ryoko, I just wanted to know." Ryoko let out a sigh, either due to being tired or annoyed. "Izuku, spit it out already." The green-haired teen gulped a little. "Okay, I was just wondering ... how do you see me? Really, I know you want me to be your partner in space, but is there anything more to that?" "Oh," said Ryoko. As she spoke, Izuku could hear the water rustling a little as if she were straightening up. "In all honesty, you're like a little brother to me." "Really?" said Izuku, unable to hold the surprise from his voice. "Because, well, the way we first met you were, well, and it's just that." Again his voice trailed off, his head turning to look at the divider. "Izuku, you're not the first person I've flirted with," came Ryoko's response, a light chuckle in her voice. "I'll admit that I like you. You're not boring and you're fun to tease. Being around you is fun, but it can also be annoying. Not because of the mumbling, but the times when you get overly emotional. You know what I'm talking about, the waterworks and stuff. It feels like your quirk is really having geysers behind your eyes. Just a major turn-off for me." Ryoko then paused for a moment. "Are you disappointed?" "No," said Izuku with a sigh as he turned to sit, his back pressing against the divider. "To be honest, I feel the same way about you. Felt like it for some time. You're the big sister I never had. You're strong, outgoing, pushing me to have fun even if it's out of my comfort zone. I think those are the sorts of things sisters do for their little brothers. Not to mention drop-dead gorgeous," added Ryoko in such a manner that Izuku could practically hear her smug smile. "Not to mention the teasing like a sister," muttered Izuku. "But, yeah, I don't see you as anything else," finished Izuku, lightly chuckling at Ryoko's vanity. He didn't mention that being one of the things that annoyed him at times, or her stealing in former life of piracy. "Do you regret it?" asked Ryoko suddenly. "Not having brothers or sisters?" Izuku frowned as he looked down at his reflection once more, watching it slightly ripple. If he were being honest, he had never really thought about it since, up until recently, it had always been just him and his mother. Sure, maybe when he was younger he thought about it, but he was sure those had just been the fleeting thoughts of a friendless child, one desperate to have someone his own age who would talk to him, spend time with him. But had he ever given the subject any serious thought? No, at least, not to the same level or degree he spent analyzing quirks and dreaming of being a hero. A soft sigh escaped Izuku's lips as his mind went to properly think about the subject. If he had an older brother or sister, how would he have reacted if they had a quirk when he didn't? Would he resent them? No, he had never harbored anything like that towards his mother or father. And who knows, maybe they would have supported him in his dreams, or at least been there for him so he wouldn't have been so alone. What about a younger sibling? That thought caused a bit of Izuku's heart to pinch. If his parents had some genetic trait hiding in the background of their DNA that would give birth to a quirkless child, then the odds were good that the same thing would have happened to any children born after him. He or she would have suffered the same way Izuku had, being born powerless in a world brimming with the powerful. Then he would have to be strong for them. And if they had been born with quirks ... then ... Izuku shook his head. He honestly didn't want to go down any dark, mental roads. Nothing that can be done about that now, said Izuku honestly. Besides, I'm happy with the one I ended up with. And from there, the two just sat there in the hot springs, staring up at the endless night sky above them in silence.